Hey there and welcome back. If you have reached that hour when the day has finally let go of you and the lamps are low and there is nothing left that needs doing tonight, then you are exactly where you should be, because we are going somewhere far away together into a world of moats and candlelight and long ambition. Tonight we are going to spend a few unhurried hours in the company of a man whose name you almost certainly know, though you probably know it only as a shadow attached to somebody else. He was a courtier and a diplomat, a husband of nearly 40 years, the father of 5 children, and he lived through the strangest and most dangerous reign in all of English history. But history has never quite allowed him a life of his own. To almost everyone who has ever heard of him, he is a single phrase, a footnote, a man defined entirely by his daughter. He is Anne Boleyn's father. Tonight we are going to give him back the whole of his life, from the Norfolk boyhood to the last quiet years, and I am going to show you the marriage he made, the children he buried, the 2 daughters he sent out into the world, and what it cost him. And somewhere in these hours we will come to a small church in Kent, and a slab of dark marble, and the brass figure of an old man lying in his robes with a falcon carved above his head. And I will tell you why that falcon is the saddest thing in the whole of that church. Before we go back into his world, I want to say that if you find a kind of quiet in these slow journeys into the past, you are very welcome to follow along, so that the next of these evenings can come and find you when you would like the company. And I would be glad to know if you ever feel like telling me where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, whether it is rain against your window or snow or simply the ordinary dark. You are always welcome to leave a word below, for I love reading them, and there is something that moves me in the thought of a man 5 centuries gone, whose name was spoken with envy and then with pity and then hardly at all, being remembered tonight by so many people in so many far-off rooms. But none of that is asked of you now. All that is asked is that you let the day slip off your shoulders and come with me across the years into the cold green counties of Tudor England, where a boy is growing up in a great house that his family has only just learned to afford. Picture this. It is a grey afternoon in Norfolk, near the end of the 15th century, and we are standing in the courtyard of a large brick house called Blickling, set among flat fields and wide skies, with the wind coming in off the marshes and the rooks turning over the trees. It is new money made solid, handsome and well built, the sort of place a family raises when it has climbed and means to stay climbed. Inside there is a boy of perhaps 9 or 10 at his book, learning the French that will make his fortune, and he cannot guess yet that he will end his life an earl, or that he will hold the highest offices in the land, or that a king of England will one day take both of his daughters, and that everything this family has built will be spent in the end on that. He is only a boy at his lessons in a cold room with the light going. His name is Thomas Boleyn. Let's go in and begin at the beginning with the man who bought this house. Let us begin by being honest about why we so rarely think of him at all. Thomas Boleyn has come down to us across 5 centuries in a very particular shape, and it is not a flattering one. He is the grasping father. He is the man who pushed his daughters at a king, who traded their bodies for titles, who stood by while they were destroyed and never lifted a finger to save them. He is a figure of appetite and calculation, a courtier so hungry for advancement that he would spend his own children to get it, and when he appears in the stories at all, he appears as a kind of villain, cold and scheming at the edge of the frame, while the real drama unfolds around his daughter. Some of that is fair, a good deal of it is not. Nearly all of it comes from looking at his life backwards, from the end, through the smoke of what happened in that last terrible spring, when everything he had built came down in the space of 17 days. We know how his story finishes, and because of that we read the whole of it as a march toward that ending, as though he had planned it, as though every step he took from boyhood onward was a step toward the scaffold on which two of his children would die. But he did not know how it would end. Nobody ever does. He was a man living forwards, as we all live forwards, making the choices that seemed sensible at the time, in a world whose rules he had not written and could not change. And if we want to understand him at all, we must try to walk beside him rather than stand at the end of the road and pass judgment on the whole journey. It is worth asking where the black legend of Thomas Boleyn actually comes from, because it did not come from the people who knew him. It came, in large part, from the same place as the extra finger on his daughter's hand. After the family fell, and especially after Elizabeth came to the throne and it became impossible to attack the Queen directly, the Catholic writers in exile abroad went after her mother and her mother's family instead, and they invented freely and they wrote well. It was they who gave us the pandering father, the family of upstarts, the coven of ambition. And then, centuries later, the storytellers came, and a scheming father is far too useful a character to give up, and so he hardened into the shape he has now. Very little of it comes from the record. The record gives us a diplomat, a linguist, a correspondent of Erasmus, a knight of the Garter, and a man who at the worst moment of his life did something cowardly, which is a different and more complicated person than the one in the stories. So let me tell you what we are going to do tonight. We are going to take this man out from behind his daughter and look at him properly, and give him the whole of his life rather than the one famous chapter of it. We will begin where he began, in a family that was climbing hard and had not yet arrived, and we will follow him through the marriage that made him, and into the nursery where his children were born and where some of them died. We will watch him become one of the most travelled and accomplished men in England, fluent in the languages of courts, trusted with the confidences of kings and emperors. We will see the two daughters go out into the world, and we will see what the world did with them. We will stand with him at the very summit of his fortunes, an earl twice over, holding one of the great offices of the realm, the grandfather of a future queen. And then we will be there when it all falls, and afterwards, in the long quiet years when he was an old man in an empty house with a wife who was dying, and one daughter left whom he had disowned. For that, I suspect, is the part of the story nobody tells. Everyone knows what happened to Anne. Everyone knows the sword and the scaffold and the green at the tower. But no one ever asks what it was like afterwards, for the man who had made her, who had raised her and taught her, and sent her out, and watched her rise higher than any Boleyn had ever dreamed of rising. Nobody asks what it is like to bury your son and your daughter in the same week, and then to go on living for another 3 years. Nobody asks what was said or not said in the house at Hever between an old man and his wife of nearly 40 years in the months after their children were gone. And I want to show you something else too, something that I find quietly astonishing. In the little parish church at Hever in Kent, in the chapel that his own grandfather built, Thomas lies beneath a slab of dark marble with a brass figure laid upon it. He is shown in his robes with the insignia of the highest order of chivalry in England, the Garter about his knee, an old man in his glory, and it is a fine memorial, the memorial of a man who had reached the top of the world. But look at his head. Above his head, on the helm on which it rests, there is a crest, and the crest is a falcon. A falcon displayed wings open, and that falcon was not his badge. It was hers. It was Anne's, the badge she had taken as queen, the crowned white falcon of the woman who had been executed for treason 3 years before, whose name had been struck from the records, and whose marriage had been declared null, and whose daughter had been made a bastard. And there it sits, carved above her father's head, in the church where he was buried for anyone to see. We will come back to that falcon at the end of the evening, when we understand what it might mean. But hold on to it, because I think it is the one thing in the whole of his long calculating worldly life that cannot be explained by calculation at all. So that is where we are going. Not to a villain, and not to a hero either, but to a man, an ordinary ambitious man of his time, who did what the men of his time did, and who was rewarded beyond all imagining, and then punished beyond all bearing. Let us start with where the Boleyns came from, because it matters enormously, and because it is not where you might think. The first thing to understand about the Boleyns is that they were new, not new in the sense of yesterday, for the family was old enough in its way, but new to the world in which Thomas would spend his life, new to the great houses and the councils, and the company of earls. They had not come down from the Norman conquest with a sword in their hands and a barony in their pocket. They had come up. They had come up from trade, out of the counting houses of London, and everything he ever had began with a man standing behind a counter selling cloth. That man was his great-grandfather's son, his own grandfather, Geoffrey Boleyn, and he is one of the most remarkable figures in the whole family, though hardly anyone remembers his name. Geoffrey came out of Norfolk, from a family of modest standing, tenant farmers and small gentry of the sort that filled the English countryside in their thousands, and he did what an ambitious young man of that age did, if he had wit and no fortune. He went to London. He apprenticed himself to a trade, and the trade he chose was mercery, the selling of fine cloth, of silks and velvets and linens, the luxury goods of a rising and hungry country, and he was extremely good at it. We should pause on what that trade meant, because it is easy for us to hear the word merchant and think of something small and dusty. It was nothing of the kind. The great London merchants of that age were among the richest men in England, richer than many a lord, handling goods worth fortunes, lending money to the crown, financing the wars and the ambitions of kings. To be a master mercer of London was to sit near the top of the wealthiest city in the kingdom, and Geoffrey Boleyn climbed that ladder rung by rung until he stood at the very top of it. He became an alderman, and then, in his greatest hour, he became Lord Mayor of London, which is to say the first citizen of the capital, a man who dined with princes and lent to the crown and rode through the streets in scarlet with the sword of the city carried before him. And then he did what every successful merchant of that age did with his money, which was to turn it into land, because land was the only thing that truly counted. Money could be lost, and money smelled of the shop, but land was permanence. Land was gentility. Land was the alchemy that turned a tradesman's grandson into a gentleman. So Geoffrey bought. He bought the manor of Blickling in Norfolk, a fine estate with a great house, in the county his family had come from, and he bought Hever in Kent, a small moated castle with lands about it, and with those two purchases he transformed his family forever. His descendants would not be merchants. They would be landed gentlemen with country seats, and their children would marry into the families of knights, and their grandchildren, if fortune smiled, might marry higher still. Geoffrey also did one other thing that was in its way even more important. He married well. He married the daughter of a lord, and in doing so he did what money has always done, which is to buy blood. The lord got the merchant's fortune. The merchant got the lord's name in his family tree, and the children of that union were something new in England, gentry with a fine house and a noble grandmother and money behind them. This was the pattern, repeated over and over through Thomas Boleyn's family for 3 generations, and it is the key to the whole story. Every Boleyn marriage was a step upward. Every generation reached higher than the last. They never quite lived down where they came from. That is the thing that runs under the whole family story like a nerve. The old nobility of England, the men whose ancestors had come over with the Conqueror, knew exactly what the Boleyns were, and they did not forget, and when the moment came they said it out loud. When Anne was queen, one of the great ladies of the court could still be heard to sneer about the merchant stock. Their enemies called them upstarts for 4 generations, right up to the scaffold and past it, and that, I think, explains a good deal of the hunger. A family that has arrived is comfortable. A family that has nearly arrived, that is always one insult away from being reminded of the shop, is not comfortable at all, and it climbs, and it keeps climbing, long past the point where any sensible person would have stopped and enjoyed the view. Geoffrey's son, and Thomas Boleyn's father, was William Boleyn, and William continued the family's steady rise without ever quite blazing. He was a knight. He held the offices of the countryside, sheriff of this county and that. He sat as a considerable landowner in Norfolk and Kent. He lived the comfortable and respectable life of an English gentleman of good estate. And he married, as his father had done, considerably above himself. He married Margaret Butler, and with that marriage the Boleyn family reached out of the English gentry altogether, and took hold of something far grander and far more dangerous, an ancient Irish earldom, and the blood that went with it. We will come to Margaret in a moment, for she deserves a chapter of her own, but hold the shape of this in your mind, because it explains everything about the man we have come to meet. Thomas Boleyn was born into a family that had risen from a London shop to a country estate in 3 generations, and had done it by working hard, marrying well, and never once being satisfied. Ambition was not a vice that Thomas invented. It was the family trade. It was the water he swam in from the day he was born. He inherited it as surely as he inherited the brick house at Blickling and the moat at Hever, when we come, in a little while, to accuse him of pushing his daughters forward, of using his children as instruments of advancement. We should remember that he was doing exactly what his father had done with him, and his grandfather before that, and that in the world he lived in, nobody would have thought it strange at all. Indeed, a father who did not do it would have been thought a fool, and a poor parent besides, careless of his children's futures. The Boleyns were climbers. That was the whole of their identity. The engine that had carried them from a counter in Cheapside to a moated castle in Kent in 3 generations. It is worth pausing on what Geoffrey Boleyn actually did all day, because the word merchant hides so much. He dealt in the most desirable goods in Europe, silk that had come overland from the east and by galley from Venice, velvet from Genoa and Lucca, fine linen from the Low Countries, cloth of gold, which was exactly what its name says, real gold beaten into thread and woven into fabric, and which was so precious that the law forbade anyone below a certain rank to wear it at all. Monsieur sold status. He sold the very stuff that separated a duke from a draper, and to do it he had to know the courts and the fashions and the shipping and the credit of half a continent, and he had to be trusted by people who bought on account and paid late, if at all, and some of whom were kings. The skills that he would later deploy in the council chambers of Europe, the languages, the judgment of men, the endless patient reading of what people wanted and what they would settle for, were not invented by him. They were the family trade, learned across a counter and passed down, and the Boleyns had one more climb to make, though none of them could have guessed how high it would take them, or what it would cost when they got there. Let us turn now to the woman who gave Thomas his most dangerous inheritance, his mother. His mother was called Margaret Butler, and she brought into the Boleyn family something the Boleyns had never had and could not buy, which was ancient blood and a great name, and she brought with it a quarrel that would follow her son to the end of his life. Margaret was a daughter of Thomas Butler, the 7th Earl of Ormond, and to understand what that meant we must look across the water to Ireland, where the Butlers were one of the 2 or 3 greatest families in the land. They were not Irish in origin, but of the old Norman stock that had come over centuries before and settled and taken root and become, in time, more powerful than any king could comfortably allow. The Earls of Ormond held vast lands. They ruled great swaths of the south and east. They had castles and followings and a lineage that ran back into the mists, and they were, by any reckoning, magnificent. The Earl of Ormond had no son. He had daughters, 2 of them, and Margaret was one. and when he died his enormous inheritance would have to find its way to somebody, and the question of who would get it was the question that would poison 4 decades of her son's life. But that lay far in the future. What mattered at the time was simpler and more immediate. When William Boleyn, a knight of Norfolk with a merchant's fortune behind him, married the daughter of the Earl of Ormond, he pulled off one of the great matches of his generation. Think of what it meant. His grandfather had sold cloth, his father had bought land, and now he had married the daughter of one of the mightiest earls in Ireland, a woman whose blood ran back to the Plantagenets themselves, and whose children would carry that blood in their veins. The Boleyns had arrived, or very nearly. They were no longer merely a family with money and a fine house. They were a family with a great connection, and that in the world they lived in was everything. We know very little about Margaret Butler herself, and that silence is worth pausing on, for it tells us something about how these lives were recorded. She was, by any measure, an important woman, an earl's daughter, a co-heiress to one of the richest inheritances of the age, the mother of a man who would sit at the right hand of the King of England and the grandmother of a queen. And we know almost nothing of her. We cannot say what she looked like or what she thought. We do not have her letters, if she wrote any that survived. We do not know whether she was clever or kind or fierce or timid, whether she loved her husband, whether she grieved for the children she lost. She married very young, as girls of her rank did, and she bore her children, and she lived a very long life indeed, long enough to see her granddaughter crowned Queen of England, and long enough, it seems, to see that granddaughter destroyed. And through all of it, she is a name on a page, a line in a pedigree, a set of arms quartered on a monument. That is what happened to almost all of them, the women of that world, and it is one of the reasons I find these evenings worth spending. The men left records because the men held offices and wrote dispatches and had their doings entered in the rolls of the state. The women, unless they were queens or unless some accident of survival preserved their letters, simply vanish, leaving behind a name, a marriage, a list of children, and silence. Margaret Butler carried the blood that made her son's fortune and gave him his highest title, and we cannot even tell you the colour of her eyes. What we can tell you is what she gave him. She gave him first the blood. Through his mother, Thomas Boleyn was the grandson of an earl, and that changed how the world saw him from the moment he was born. He was not a merchant's grandson, whatever his enemies might mutter behind their hands. He was an earl's grandson, kin to the Butlers, kin through them to half the nobility of 2 kingdoms, and that gave him an entry into rooms that his grandfather could never have entered, and she gave him, second, the claim. When the old Earl of Ormond finally died, an immensely aged man who had outlived nearly everyone, his lands and titles fell to his 2 daughters as co-heiresses, and Margaret's share of that inheritance passed, in time, to her eldest son. Thomas Boleyn thus found himself the possessor of a claim to one of the greatest earldoms in Ireland, a claim that was legally arguable, enormously valuable, and fiercely disputed by a Butler cousin who had no intention whatever of handing over his family's ancient patrimony to an Englishman he regarded as an upstart. That quarrel would run for decades. It would consume years of his energy and a great deal of his money, and it would be settled in the end not by law or by justice, but by the whim of a king who happened, at that moment, to want something from him. But we will come to that. For now, hold this in your mind. The boy at his book in the cold room at Blickling had, running in his veins, the blood of a London mercer and the blood of an Irish earl, and both of those inheritances would shape everything he did. From the one he took the appetite, the head for business, the understanding that fortunes are made by those who go out and make them. From the other he took the claim, the sense of entitlement, the knowledge that he was owed something great and would have to fight to get it. He was a merchant's grandson with an earl's blood and an earl's expectations, and there was no possibility on earth that such a man would sit quietly at home in Norfolk and be content with what he had. And I should say plainly what was at stake in that Irish inheritance, because it was not a matter of a coronet and a nice name. The Ormond lands were enormous. They were among the greatest estates in Ireland, castles and towns and rents and rights over territory that a man could not ride across in a day, and the family that held them had for generations been one of the two hinges on which the whole English position in Ireland turned. Whoever held Ormond was a power, not a courtier with a title but a magnate with an army. Half of that was, in strict law, Thomas Boleyn's by descent from his mother, and the man in possession, Piers Butler, was a formidable Irish lord with the lands under his feet and the loyalty of the people on them, and he had no more intention of yielding to an Englishman with a piece of parchment than he had of jumping into the sea. It was not a lawsuit. It was a slow war, fought in courtrooms and council chambers for 3 decades, and it shaped every calculation he ever made. So let us go back into that cold room and look at the boy himself and at the education that made him, for it is here, in the schoolroom at Blickling, that the whole of his career was quietly decided. He was born, so far as we can tell, in the late 1470s, though the records of that age are careless about such matters, and we cannot be sure to the year. His birthplace was almost certainly Blickling, the great brick house in Norfolk that his grandfather had bought, though some have argued for Hever in Kent, and it hardly matters, for the family moved between their houses as such families did, and both were home. What matters is the country he grew up in, and it was a hard, wide, wind-scoured country, the flat fields and the enormous skies of Norfolk, the marshes and the wool towns and the great churches that the wool money had built. It was rich country, and it was Boleyn country, where the family were people of consequence, and a boy growing up there would have been shown a good deal of deference by everyone he met. He was the eldest son, which meant that everything the family had would one day be his, and it also meant that everything the family hoped for rested on him. He had brothers and sisters, and one of his sisters had died in early childhood, a little girl of not quite 4, whose small brass still lies in the church at Blickling, with her age set out upon it in years and months and days, as though her family could not bear to round it off. That is one of those details that reaches across 500 years and takes you by the throat. Somebody counted the days. Somebody in the depth of their grief insisted that the stone should say precisely how long she had been alive, down to the day, because every one of those days had mattered. That was the house Thomas grew up in, and that was the ordinary arithmetic of family life in that age, when the graves of children were dug in every churchyard in England, and no house, however rich, was spared. Now, the education. This is the part that made him, and it is worth dwelling on because it was not ordinary. He was given, or acquired, an education far better than most young gentlemen of his rank received, and above all he became a linguist. He learned French, and he learned it not in the halting schoolroom fashion of most Englishmen, but properly, fluently, well enough to speak it and write it, and be understood as an equal in a French-speaking court. And he learned Latin, the universal language of diplomacy and learning, and learned that well too, well enough that scholars later thought him a man worth writing to. In an England where the nobility were, by and large, magnificently uninterested in books, where a great lord might be barely literate and think none the worse of himself for it. Here was a young man of the middling gentry who could talk to anybody in Europe. We should be clear about what a weapon that was. England in those years was a small, cold, damp kingdom on the edge of things, and its court was provincial by the standards of the continent. But it needed to do business with the great powers, with France, and with the Empire, and with the papacy. And to do that business, It needed men who could go abroad and speak, and be understood, and negotiate, and charm, and listen. Such men were rare. Most English gentlemen could fight, and hunt, and manage an estate, and that was the whole of their equipment. A man who could sit at a table in Brussels or Paris and hold his own in the language of the room, who could catch the nuance and the joke and the veiled threat, who could write a dispatch home explaining precisely what had been meant as opposed to what had been said, was worth more to a king than a dozen knights. And Thomas was that man. That is the plain truth of his career, and it is what gets lost when we reduce him to the father who sold his daughters. He rose in the first place because he was extremely good at a difficult job that hardly anyone else in England could do at all. He was clever, he was cultivated, he was charming when he needed to be. He had an excellent memory and a cool head, and the patience for the endless, tedious, delicate work of negotiation. Kings do not send fools abroad to speak for them. They send their sharpest men, and for the better part of 3 decades, across 2 reigns, the Crown of England sent this man. He was accomplished in other ways too, in the ways that mattered at court. He was a fine horseman and a notable jouster, good enough to ride in the royal tournaments before the king and hold his own among the young bloods of the court. He could dance and make conversation and pay a compliment. He had, in short, the whole equipment of the perfect courtier, the man who is useful in the council chamber in the morning and ornamental in the hall at night. And if he had been born into a great family, he would have been a considerable man by his own merits alone. But he was not born into a great family. He was born into a rising one, and rising families need marriages. There is one more measure of his learning, and it is a good one. Years later, when he was a man of consequence, the most celebrated scholar in Europe corresponded with him. Erasmus, the great humanist, the man whose books were read from Poland to Portugal, wrote to him and dedicated work to him, and you do not do that for a dull man with a fat purse, whatever the flatterers of the age were prepared to do for money. Erasmus was fastidious about who he addressed. He wrote to Thomas as one educated man to another, about scripture and about learning, and the fact of that correspondence tells us something the offices and the titles cannot. This was a genuinely cultivated man. He read, he thought, he had opinions about the new learning that was shaking Europe, and he was interesting enough to hold the attention of the finest mind of the age. Whatever else we say about him tonight, and we shall say some hard things, we are not talking about a brute. And so, while he was still a young man with his career all before him, his father and his family began looking about for a wife for him, and what they found was so far above what a Boleyn had any right to expect that it changes the whole shape of our story. Let us turn to her now, for she is the most important person in his life, and almost nobody has ever heard of her. Her name was Elizabeth Howard, and she was the eldest daughter of Thomas Howard. And if you know anything at all about the Tudor century, you will know that the Howards were not a family, they were a force of nature. They were the premier noble house of England. They were Dukes of Norfolk, the grandest title in the peerage below the blood royal, and they had been great for generations, and they would go on being great, in one form or another, for centuries to come. And to marry a Howard was to marry the aristocracy of England at its very apex. So the first question we must ask is the obvious one. How on earth did a Boleyn manage it? How did the grandson of a London cloth merchant persuade the eldest daughter of the head of the Howard family to come to him? And the answer is one of the small ironies of history, and it is this. At the moment the match was made, the Howards were down. Consider the timing. Not many years before, at Bosworth Field, the Howards had made the greatest mistake it was possible to make. They had backed the losing king. They had fought for Richard III against Henry Tudor, and the head of the family had been killed on the field, and his son, Elizabeth's father, had been taken prisoner and attainted and stripped of the dukedom and thrown into the Tower, where he sat for a long time, while a new dynasty settled itself onto the throne. The Howards had been on the wrong side of history, and they were paying for it. Their titles were gone, their lands were forfeit, their name was under a cloud, and a Howard daughter, however grand her blood, was suddenly a great deal less marriageable than she had been a few years before. And here came the Boleyns with money and land and no political stain whatever, offering a solid, prosperous, blameless match to a family that was fighting its way back from ruin. It suited both sides perfectly. The Howards got a son-in-law with a clean record and a full purse. The Boleyns got the blood of the premier house in England. His income at the time of the marriage was modest, no great fortune at all, a sum that would barely keep a gentleman's household in dignity, and he married the daughter of the man who would become the second Duke of Norfolk. It was the deal of a lifetime, and it worked spectacularly because the Howards did not stay down. Elizabeth's father was a survivor of genius, a man of iron competence who set himself, from the moment he came out of the Tower, to serving the new dynasty so faithfully and so well that it could not afford to do without him. He clawed his way back, inch by inch, year upon patient year, until one day in the north he was handed the chance to settle the matter for good. And Thomas, who had married into the family when they were prisoners and outcasts, found himself, quite without effort, the son-in-law of the Duke of Norfolk. He had bought at the bottom of the market, as his merchant grandfather might have put it, and he had been proved right beyond his wildest hopes. The battle that did it was fought in the north at Flodden, while the king was away in France chasing glory. The Scots came over the border in enormous strength, and the old Earl of Surrey, Elizabeth's father, who was 70 years old and had been carried north in a cart because he could no longer ride the whole way, met them and destroyed them utterly. The Scottish king died on the field with the flower of his nobility around him. It was the most complete English victory in living memory, and it was won by the attainted son of a man who had died fighting the present king's father. After that there was nothing more to be said. The dukedom came back, and the Howards were restored, and Thomas Boleyn's father-in-law was once more the second man in England after the king. Thomas had married a girl whose family were disgraced prisoners, and 13 years later he was the son-in-law of the Duke of Norfolk, the victor of Flodden, and he had not had to do a single thing to bring it about except choose well and wait. Now, what of her? What of Elizabeth Howard herself, who is about to become the most important person in this story, and who will be, throughout it, almost entirely silent? She was, everyone agreed, a great beauty. That much comes down to us. In her youth she was one of the ornaments of the court, and a poet of the age wrote of her loveliness, and she moved in the highest circles as an earl's daughter, and then a duke's daughter should. She served at court, she attended the Queen, she was present at the great occasions of the reign, and then she married Thomas, and she began to bear children, and the record goes almost entirely quiet. And for the next 4 decades she is a shadow at the edge of her husband's story, and then at the edge of her daughter's. But think what she was, consider what she brought, and what she must have been. She was a Howard, raised in the certainty of her own consequence, a girl who had grown up knowing that she was of the first blood in England, and she married a man whose grandfather had kept a shop. However advantageous the match, however necessary in the family's reduced circumstances, there must have been something in that for her to swallow. And she brought into the marriage the thing that Thomas most needed, which was not money and not land but standing. The simple fact of the Howard name in his family, the connection that opened every door in the kingdom. Everything he became partly through her. The great career, the embassies, the titles, the intimacy with the king, all of it rested on the foundation that she laid simply by marrying him. They were married for close to 4 decades. Think about that for a moment in an age when so many marriages were cut short by death in childbed, or by plague, or by the ordinary hazards of a dangerous world. 40 years, 5 children, the rise from a modest gentleman's income to an earldom. And at the end of it, the loss of nearly everything. Whatever passed between them across all that time, and we have almost no evidence of it, they were bound together for the whole of their adult lives, and they went through every single thing that happened, the triumphs and the horror alike, side by side. I wish I could tell you that they loved one another. I cannot. The evidence simply does not exist, and I will not invent it for you. What I can tell you is that they stayed together, that no whisper of separation or estrangement ever attaches to them, that they raised their children and rose together and fell together, and that when she died at last, an old woman worn out by grief, he outlived her by less than a year. Make of that what you will. In a world where marriage was a contract and love was a lucky accident, that is not nothing. Let us go now into the house they made together and meet the children. 5 children, that is the number the records give us, and behind that flat number lies the whole hidden emotional history of this family, and a great deal of grief that nobody has ever properly counted. Let us take them in order, so far as we can, though the order itself is disputed and always will be. There was a son called Thomas, named for his father as eldest sons were. There was a son called Henry. There was a daughter, Mary. There was another daughter, Anne, and there was another son, George. 5 children born to Elizabeth Howard in the space of perhaps a decade, in the first years of the new century, at Blickling and at Hever, brought into the world in the way that all children were brought into the world in that age, in a curtained room with the windows sealed and the fire built up, among women, in danger, and 2 of them died. The 2 little boys, Thomas and Henry, both died in childhood, and they went early, and almost nothing survives about them except that they existed and that they were gone. There is a suggestion that the sweating sickness took them, that terrible and mysterious disease that came upon England again and again in that age and killed with a speed that terrified everyone who saw it. A healthy person at breakfast and a corpse by supper. Whether that was what carried them off, we cannot be certain. What we can be certain of is that Thomas and Elizabeth Boleyn buried 2 sons. I want to stay here for a moment because this is exactly the sort of thing that gets one line in the histories and then is passed over forever, and it should not be. These were not statistics. These were their children. Somewhere in the early days of that marriage, in a house in Norfolk or in Kent, 2 small boys sickened and died, and their mother, who had carried them and borne them and nursed them and watched them learn to walk, had to give them up and see them buried. And their father, who had named the elder for himself, who had looked at that child and seen the whole future of his family and his name, had to stand at the graveside and go on. We do not know what they felt. We never do with these people. The letters that might have told us have not survived, if they were ever written. But we know that they felt it, because they were human beings, and because everything the record tells us about that world says that the notion that people in the past did not grieve for their dead children, that the sheer frequency of it somehow blunted them to it, is one of the cruelest and most persistent falsehoods we tell about our ancestors. They grieved. The little brass at Blickling with the days counted out on it tells us that they grieved. They simply grieved in a world where grief was not permitted to stop anything, where the harvest still had to come in, and the household still had to be run, and the next child still had to be born. And if it was the sweat that took those 2 little boys, then it is worth knowing what that meant, because it is one of the strangest horrors of that century and it has never come back. The sweating sickness arrived in England in the year the Tudors took the throne, as though it had come over with them, and it returned again and again for the next 70 years and then vanished from the earth entirely, and has never been seen since. Nobody knows what it was. It killed with a speed that broke the minds of the people who watched it. A person would be well in the morning, and then would feel a cold shivering, and then a heat and a sweat, and a great fear would come upon them, and a longing to sleep, and if they slept they died. The households of the sick would walk them up and down for hours, slapping them, shouting at them, keeping them on their feet. And within a day it was over, one way or the other. It fell hardest, and this is the part that made the age think it was a judgment on the young, the strong, the well-fed, the prosperous. It killed the people who had everything to live for, and it came for the Boleyns more than once. And so, when the losses were counted, 3 children were left, Mary and Anne and George, 2 daughters and 1 son. That arithmetic is the hinge of the entire story, and I want to make sure you see it. Thomas Boleyn was the head of a rising family with 1 surviving son. Everything, the whole enterprise, the name, the lands, the ambitions of 4 generations now rested on one boy's life, and boys died as he had cause to know better than most. And he had 2 daughters, and daughters in the world he lived in were not liabilities, and they were not decorations. They were the family's other instruments. They were how you made alliances, how you reached upward, how you bound your family to houses greater than your own. His own father had done exactly that, marrying an earl's daughter and lifting the whole family a rung. His grandfather had done it before that. It was the family's method. So here is Thomas, somewhere around the turn of the century, a young man of 30 or so, married to a Howard, with a seat in Norfolk and a castle in Kent, and a claim to an Irish earldom, and a career at court just beginning to open. And he has 1 son and 2 little girls. And any man of his time, looking at those 2 little girls, would have seen not only his daughters but his future, the 2 best cards in his hand, and would have begun, quite naturally and without the smallest sense of doing anything wrong, to think about how they might be played. We flinch at that. We should be honest that we flinch at it, but we must also be honest that it was not cruelty, and it was not, in his mind, or in anyone's mind, a betrayal of his children. It was fatherhood. It was what a good father did. A father who did not think hard about his daughters' marriages, who did not use every connection he had to place them as high as they could possibly go, was not a kind man in the eyes of that world. He was a negligent one, a man who had failed his children, who had left them to sink to a level beneath their blood. Thomas Boleyn intended to do well by his daughters, by every standard he had been taught, and he did do well by them, so magnificently well that it destroyed them both. But all of that is far ahead, for now there are 3 children in the nursery, and the son is on the moat, and let us go and look at the place they grew up in, because you know it, even if you do not think you do. Hever. Say the name and something rises in the mind, even if you have never been there, for it has become one of the best-known houses in England, and it owes every scrap of that fame to what happened to the family who lived in it. Picture it as it was then. It is not a great palace, and it never was. It is a small castle, more properly a fortified manor house, sitting low in a fold of the Kentish countryside among woods and water meadows, with a moat around it, and a gatehouse with a drawbridge and a portcullis, and behind that a courtyard and a range of comfortable rooms. It had been built for defence in a rougher age, and then softened, as so many such places were, into a home. By the time the Boleyns had it, it was what a prosperous gentleman's seat should be, snug and handsome and defensible, without being grim, with a great hall for dining and chambers above, and gardens beyond the water. The Boleyns had bought it, as they had bought Blickling, with Mercer's money, and it is worth noticing what that money had achieved. Here was a family that within living memory had been selling cloth in London, and now their children were being raised in a castle with a moat, riding out through their own woods, worshipping in a church where their own chapel had been built by their own grandfather. The transformation was complete. Nobody looking at the little girls running in the gardens at Hever would have taken them for anything other than what they now were, the daughters of a gentleman of standing, well-born and well-connected, with the blood of earls and dukes in them. We should imagine the life of that house, because it is the world our story's children came out of. It would have been busy and crowded, as all great households were, with servants everywhere, with the constant coming and going of horses and messengers and neighbours and tenants and clergy. It would have been cold for most of the year, the way all those houses were cold, with fires that warmed the space directly in front of them and nothing else, and rooms that held the chill of the stone through the whole of an English winter. It would have been dark early, and lit by candles and rushlights and firelight, and full of the smells of wood smoke, and cooking and damp wool and the rushes on the floor, and there would have been the ordinary sounds of children in it. 3 of them, growing, learning their letters and their manners, learning to ride, learning music, learning the 1,000 things that children of their rank were taught, Mary and Anne and George. And their mother would have been at the centre of it, running the household, ordering the stores, managing the servants, receiving the visitors, doing the enormous invisible work that fell to the wife of a rising man, and doing a good deal of it alone. For here is the thing about their father, he was hardly ever there. That is not a criticism of him, it is simply the shape of his life. His career was a career of absence. He was a courtier, and then an ambassador, and courtiers must be at court, and ambassadors must be abroad. And for great stretches of his children's childhoods he was in London, or in Brussels, or in Paris, or riding across Europe on the king's business. He would come home, and be a great man in his own hall for a while, and then he would be gone again for months. The children would have seen him as a visitor of enormous importance, a figure of authority who arrived and filled the house and then rode away, and Elizabeth would have run the place in his absence, and raised the children largely herself. That is worth sitting with. When we picture Thomas scheming over his daughters, plotting their futures, we tend to picture him hovering over them. He was not hovering over them. He was almost never in the same country. The decisions he made for them were made from a distance, in letters, between negotiations, in the snatched moments of a working life spent largely on the road. And the woman who was actually there, who taught them, who watched them grow, who knew them, was their mother, about whom we know almost nothing at all. I find that a haunting imbalance. All we know is about him, because he held the offices and wrote the dispatches. Everything that mattered to those 3 children, day by day, year by year, came from her, and it is gone, all of it, without a trace. Hever, though, is where they came back to. It was home in the way that a house you are always leaving becomes home, and it is where eventually everything would end, for it was at Hever that Anne would be sent when the king began to want her, and the family thought it best that she should be a little out of reach, and it is at Hever that her father would come, in the end, when everything was over, and there was nowhere else to go. And it is at Hever that he would die, and in the church across the field that he would be buried. The house has become a shrine to Anne now, and thousands go there every year to walk where she walked and imagine her at the windows. And it is smaller than you expect. That is what everybody says who goes. You come to it down a lane, and there is the moat and the little gatehouse, and the whole thing could sit inside the courtyard of a proper palace with room to spare. It is a gentleman's house, not a magnate's, built for a family of substance, and no more, and the Boleyns never rebuilt it into anything grander, even when they had 2 earldoms and the Queen of England in the family. That tells us something, I think. They did not need to. Hever was never meant to impress anybody. It was the place they came back to. The impressing was done at court, in London, in the robes and the barges and the retinues. Hever was where you took the robes off, and the parish church stands a couple of 100 paces from the gatehouse, across a field, so close that you could walk it in the rain without much minding, and in it is the family chapel that Geoffrey the Mercer built. The whole world of that family, the house they lived in, and the ground they were buried in, sits within 5 minutes of itself in a fold of the Kentish Weald, and you can stand in the middle of it and turn round once and see all of it. But it was his house first, and his grandfather's before that, and it was where he was born, or near enough, and it was where he came home to die, and if any place on earth was his, it was that one. Let us leave it now in its green quiet, with the children in the garden, and their mother at the accounts and the swans on the moat, and let us follow the father out onto the road, and see how he made his fortune. For the world was about to change, and a new king was coming, and he was exactly the sort of man that new king was going to need. The court that Thomas first came to as a young man belonged to Henry VII, the first Tudor, and it was a very particular sort of place. The old king was a careful, cold, watchful man who had won his crown on a battlefield, and never for one moment forgot how easily it might be taken from him. He did not spend money if he could help it. He did not trust anybody very far. He built his power on accounts and marriages, and quiet, relentless pressure, and his court reflected him. It was sober, businesslike, unglamorous, a place where a man got on by being useful rather than by being brilliant. Yes, that suited him very well indeed, because being useful was precisely his gift. He came to court as a gentleman of good family and good connections, and he made himself agreeable and competent, and he began to be given things to do. We catch glimpses of him in the records of those years, and each glimpse is a small step upward. He was present at the wedding of the king's eldest son, Prince Arthur, to the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, which was the great occasion of the reign, the moment when the new dynasty announced to Europe that it had arrived and been accepted. Everyone who was anyone was there, and Thomas Boleyn was there among them, and that alone tells us that his family had reached the level where they were counted. And then there is a detail I love, because of what it foreshadows. When the king's daughter, Margaret Tudor, was sent north to Scotland to marry the Scottish king, she travelled in a great procession, a princess of England being conveyed to her husband, and among the gentlemen chosen to escort her was him. He rode north with her. He was there, in the retinue of a young girl being carried away from her family and her country to be married to a stranger for the good of the realm, and he was one of the men whose task it was to deliver her. I do not want to make too much of that. It was a routine honour, a mark of favour, the sort of duty given to promising men. But there is something in it, all the same. He watched, at close quarters, and as a young man, what happened when a king needed a marriage and a girl was the currency in which it was paid. He saw the whole machinery of it, the negotiation and the pageantry, and the girl in the middle of it being handed over. Margaret Tudor was 13 years old, and 3 decades later, when the machinery came for his own daughters, he would have had no illusions whatever about how it worked, because he had helped to work it himself when he was young. Through those years he was doing all the ordinary things a rising gentleman did. He held the local offices, Sheriff of Kent among them, the unglamorous administrative grind by which the crown governed the countryside and by which a man proved himself steady and reliable. He fought, when the king needed men, against the rebels who came out of Cornwall in a great angry column protesting against taxation, and marched on London, and were broken. He managed his estates. He attended at court. He married and got his children. He was, in short, doing exactly what 100 other young gentlemen were doing, and doing it slightly better than most, and waiting. And then, in the spring of 1509, the old king died, and everything changed. It is difficult now to convey what the accession of the new king meant, how it felt, the sheer wave of relief and joy that went through England. The old king had been respected and feared, and not much loved. He had held the kingdom together, and filled the treasury, and kept the peace, and by the end he was a suspicious, grasping, ailing man whose officials squeezed his subjects for every penny of the law. And in his place came his son, and his son was 18 years old. He was, everyone agreed, magnificent. He was tall and strong and handsome, an athlete of the first rank, a horseman and a jouster and a wrestler and a tennis player, a man who could ride all day and dance all night. He was learned, genuinely learned, with real Latin and real theology and a real gift for music. He was generous where his father had been tight, open where his father had been secretive, glorious where his father had been grey, and he wanted, more than anything, a court that shone, a court of youth and beauty and magnificence and display, a court to rival the great courts of Europe. For a man like Thomas, this was the opening of a door. The new reign wanted exactly what he had, which was polish and languages and charm, and the ability to shine at a tournament in the afternoon and negotiate in the council in the morning. And it is worth understanding how power actually worked in that court, because it was not what the organisation chart said. The formal offices mattered, but what mattered more was access, physical proximity, the right to be in the room when the king was in a good mood. The men of the Privy Chamber, who had no titles at all, who handed the king his shirt and lost money to him at cards, could do more for a petitioner in 5 minutes than a Lord Chancellor could do in a month, because they could pick the moment. Everything in that world ran on the question of who could get to him and when. And this explains a great deal about the Boleyns that gets missed. They were not a faction with an army or a territorial power base. They were a family who had got close. They had a daughter in the Queen's household, a son and a son-in-law in the Privy Chamber, a father in the council, and a girl the king could not stop thinking about. They were embedded, at every level, in the small hot centre of that court, which was the strongest possible position right up until the moment it became the most dangerous one. At the new king's coronation, he was made a Knight of the Bath, a high honour and a public mark of favour, and he was in from the beginning one of the young men around the young king, part of the Golden Company. And he could joust. That mattered enormously, more than we might think, because the tournament was the theatre in which the new reign displayed itself, and to ride in the lists before the king was to be seen. When a son was born to the king and the queen, the little prince who was to be the heir to everything, the celebration was a great tournament at Westminster, and this man rode in it, costumed and caparisoned, one of the champions of that glittering day. That prince died within weeks. It was the first of the losses that would drive Henry VIII mad with anxiety across the next 2 decades, the first small coffin in a procession of them, and it would end, eventually, in the destruction of Thomas Boleyn's family. But nobody knew that yet. On the day there was only the sunshine and the noise and the splintering lances and a young man of ambition riding well in front of his king. Let us follow him now out of England into the work that made him. In 1512, Thomas Boleyn was sent abroad as one of the king's envoys to the Low Countries, and with that appointment his real life began. The Low Countries, the rich flat lands of what we would now call Belgium and the Netherlands, were then among the most sophisticated and prosperous places in Europe, a country of great trading cities and enormous wealth of painters and musicians and printers, and they were ruled in the name of a boy who would become the most powerful man in the world by a woman. Her name was Margaret of Austria, and she is one of the most extraordinary figures of that age, and she is about to change the destiny of the Boleyn family forever. Let me tell you who she was. because she deserves it, and because it explains everything that follows. She was a daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, and her life had been a catalogue of the ways in which a royal woman could be used and discarded. She had been betrothed as a small child to the King of France and sent away to be raised at the French court as its future queen, and then, when the politics shifted, she had been rejected and sent home, a humiliated girl of 11 or 12 who had been trained for a throne and then handed back. She had been married to a prince of Spain, and he had died within months. She had been married again to a Duke of Savoy, and he had died too. Twice widowed before she was 25, twice made a bride of state, and twice bereaved, she had finally announced that she would not marry a third time, and she never did, and instead she governed. Her father made her regent of the Low Countries, ruling them on behalf of her small nephew, and she turned out to be superbly good at it. She held that great rich territory together through decades of European chaos. She negotiated, she balanced, she managed the impossible ambitions of the men around her, and she did it with a skill that made her one of the most respected rulers in Europe. And she made her court at Mechlin into one of the finest in the world, a place of books and music and paintings and civilized talk, where scholars came and artists were kept, and where an education could be had that money could not buy anywhere else. Now here is Thomas Boleyn arriving as an English envoy, and here is what happened. He and Margaret of Austria got on. They liked one another. They both spoke excellent French. They were both cultivated. They were both clever and worldly, and amused by the game they were playing. And out of the ordinary business of diplomacy, there grew something like a real friendship. We know this because of what she did for him, and what she did for him is one of the most consequential favours in English history. He asked her to take his daughter. Think about the nerve of it. Here is an English gentleman, of no great family, an ambassador on a temporary mission, asking the regent of the Low Countries, a daughter of the emperor, to take his little girl into her household as one of her maids of honour. Those places were prizes. They went to the daughters of the great families of Europe, and the competition for them was ferocious, and the woman who granted them owed nothing whatever to an Englishman she had known for 5 minutes. And she said yes. She said yes because she liked him, and because he had charmed her, and that single act of personal favour, granted across a diplomatic table in a foreign city, set in motion everything that followed, because the girl he asked for was Anne. She was very small when she went. The sources argue endlessly about how old she was, because we do not know for certain when she was born, and the whole shape of her life changes depending on which year you choose. She may have been 12 or 13. She may have been as young as 6 or 7, which sounds impossible to us, but was not impossible then. Either way, she was a child, and she was sent across the sea, alone, into a foreign court, to be raised among strangers in a language she did not yet speak. And Margaret of Austria wrote back to her father about her. That letter survives in part, and it is one of the loveliest things in this whole story. The regent of the Low Countries, one of the great women of Europe, wrote to Thomas Boleyn to tell him how pleased she was with his daughter, how well she found her for her age, how the girl was so bright and so quick and so agreeable that she was more beholden to him for sending her than he was to her for taking her. That is a woman who has fallen a little in love with somebody's clever child. And you can feel across 500 years the pride that letter must have given a father. I want to be fair to Thomas Boleyn here, because this is one of the places where the caricature of him falls apart. Yes, placing his daughter at Mechlin was a career move, an investment, a piece of ambition. It was also, by any measure, an act of remarkable paternal ambition of the good kind. He had a daughter who was clever, and he got her the finest education available to any woman in Europe. He did not do that for his sons, who were dead. He did it for a girl. In an age when a great many fathers thought a daughter needed only enough learning to say her prayers and run a household, this man used the biggest favour he had to spend on a girl's mind. Whatever else he was, he saw what Anne was, and he backed her. Margaret of Austria's court made Anne. It gave her the French, the music, the polish, the wit, the poise, the whole dazzling armoury that would one day make a king of England lose his mind. Anne would go on from there to France, to the household of the French queen, and spend the whole of her girlhood and youth abroad in the most sophisticated courts in the world. And when she came home to England at last, she would be unlike any other woman at the English court, and Henry VIII would look at her and never look away. Her father did that. He sent her. He arranged it. He made her what she became. And in doing so, without the faintest idea of what he was doing, he built the instrument of his own family's destruction. We should be exact about what Anne received at Mechlin, because it was not a finishing school, and Margaret of Austria was not a governess. That court was one of the intellectual centres of Europe. The regent kept a library of real importance, and a collection of paintings that scholars still write about. She had the finest musicians in the north of Europe in her household. Erasmus himself was in and out of her orbit. The talk at her table was the talk of people who were running a great state and reading the newest books and arguing about the ideas that were, at that very moment, beginning to crack Christendom in half. And into the middle of that walked a small English girl, and she stayed long enough for all of it to soak into her bones. What Anne learned in the Low Countries and afterwards in France was not merely how to dance and how to dress. She learned how the mind of a powerful woman worked, at first hand, from a woman who had been used and discarded by kings and had risen anyway, and now ruled a country and answered to nobody. Annie would spend the rest of her life doing an imitation of Margaret of Austria, and it very nearly worked. For the next decade or so, Thomas Boleyn was one of the busiest men in England, and I am going to move through this stretch of his career fairly briskly, not because it does not matter, but because the point of it is what it did to his family rather than what it did to the map of Europe. He was, in these years, an ambassador of the first rank. He went to France and lived there as the resident English ambassador, holding the most important diplomatic post the crown had. He was sent to the emperor, to Charles, the young man who had inherited half the world, Margaret of Austria's nephew, the most powerful monarch in Christendom. He was involved in the preparations for the greatest spectacle of the age, that extraordinary summit in a field near Calais, where the kings of England and France met amid an encampment of tents made of cloth of gold, and spent a fortune apiece trying to outshine one another, and embraced and jousted and swore eternal friendship, and went to war again within 2 years. The scale of that meeting has never really been matched, and the details of it read like invention. They built a temporary palace out of timber and canvas, painted to look like stone, with real glass windows, and a fountain outside it that ran with wine for anybody who came. Something like 3,000 tents went up in a field, 2 courts, several thousand people apiece, moved across the sea and camped for a fortnight, and every single one of them was engaged in a competition of magnificence so ferocious that men mortgaged their estates to pay for the clothes they wore for a week. Somebody counted the sheep eaten. And the point of all of it, the entire purpose of that fortnight of jousting and wrestling and wine, was to demonstrate a friendship between 2 kings which neither of them believed in for a moment, and which collapsed inside 2 years. Thomas Boleyn was in the middle of the preparations for it. This was his profession. He spent his working life inside a machine for producing appearances, and he was one of its best operators, and I think that matters when we come to judge how he behaved when the appearances stopped being enough. He was in and out of the councils. He was trusted with the most delicate business. He was, in the plainest terms, one of the half-dozen men in England whom the king relied on to speak for him abroad. And the honours came. He was made a Knight of the Garter, which was not a small thing, not a courtesy handed out to any gentleman with a good coat. The Garter was and is the highest order of chivalry in England, a company of a few dozen men only, kings and princes, and the greatest nobles of the realm, and to be admitted to it was to be told, publicly and permanently, that you had arrived at the summit of the kingdom's honour. When Thomas Boleyn put on that robe, he became something his grandfather could not have imagined in his wildest dreams. The mercer's grandson wore the Garter. Now hold two things in your mind at once, for here is where it all begins to twist. The first is that all of this was earned. Every bit of it. The embassies, the Garter, the trust of the king. All of it came to him because he was extremely good at his job, in a country where hardly anyone else could do that job at all. There is a version of this story in which Thomas Boleyn is nothing, a nobody who rose entirely on his daughters' backs, and that version is false. By the time Henry VIII had ever looked twice at a Boleyn girl, their father was already a Knight of the Garter, already a former ambassador to France, already a man of consequence in his own right. He had built that himself. The second is that the whole time he was doing it, he was away. Years of his children's lives went past while he was in Paris or Brussels or riding between them. His daughters grew up in other countries and other households. His son grew into a man. His wife ran his houses. And when he came back, he came home as a great man, laden with honours, and the family he came home to was one he had largely arranged from a distance, by letter. I keep returning to this because I think it explains something about him that gets called coldness. He was a man who managed his family the way he managed a negotiation, at long range in writing, by disposing of pieces to best advantage. That was not because he was a monster. It was because that was the only way he had ever done it, because his working life had made him that, because he had spent 3 decades learning to think about people as positions to be placed. When the great crisis of his life came, when it was his own children who were in danger, he reached for the only instrument he had ever used, which was calculation, and it was not equal to the moment. Nothing would have been. But that is what he had. Meanwhile, out in the world he had sent them into, his daughters were growing up. Mary the elder had been in France too. The sources are a tangle here, and we should be careful, but it seems she went across with the English Princess Mary Tudor when that girl was sent to marry the old King of France, and stayed on in the French court afterwards, and was there through the wild, glamorous, dangerous first years of the young King Francis, whose court was famous throughout Europe for its brilliance and infamous throughout Europe for its morals. And when Mary returned, she came home with a reputation, and I want to handle this carefully, because the reputation may have been entirely undeserved. Here is what we actually know. Years later, when it was politically useful to blacken the Boleyn name, stories were put about that Mary had been free with her favours at the French court, and that the French king himself had said unpleasant things about her. That is the whole of the evidence. It is gossip, recorded by enemies, decades after the fact, at a moment when there was every reason to invent it. It has followed Mary for 500 years, and it has shaped the way every book and each story has treated her, and it may very well be nothing but slander. She was a girl at a foreign court. Men talked. That is all we can honestly say. But her father brought her home, and did what fathers did, and found her a husband. The husband found for Mary was a man called William Carey, and it was a perfectly good match, sensible and respectable and unremarkable. He was a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, which is to say one of the small group of men who attended the king in his private rooms, dressed him, diced with him, heard his jokes and his complaints, and were therefore, in the peculiar arithmetic of that court, among the most influential people in England, despite holding no great office at all. Carey was well born, nicely connected, distantly royal in his ancestry, and going places. For a Boleyn daughter, he was a solid, useful, entirely creditable husband. They were married in the winter of 1520, and the king himself came to the wedding. That tells you where the Boleyns now stood. The King of England attended the marriage of Thomas Boleyn's elder daughter, and gave a gift, and the whole court would have noticed. It was a good day for the family, and by every standard of the age Thomas had done well by his girl. He had married her to a rising man in the king's own inner circle, and she would be at court, in the Queen's household, near the centre of everything, with a husband who could look after her, and within a year or two, at most, the King of England was sleeping with her. We do not know how it began, nor when it began, or how long it lasted, or what either of them felt about it, or whether Mary had any choice in the matter at all, which is a question we should sit with rather than skate past. This was a king. This was the man who could make or destroy her husband, her father, her whole family with a word. When such a man turns his attention on a young woman of 20 in his wife's household, the language of consent that we would use does not really fit the situation. She could hardly have refused him without consequences that would have fallen on everyone she loved. Whether she wanted him, or feared him, or was flattered by him, or endured him, we will never know, because nobody thought to ask her, and she left no word of it. What we know is that it happened, and that it was tolerably well understood at the time, and that it was handled in the way such things were handled, which is to say quietly, without acknowledgment, with everybody pretending. Her husband was given grants and offices, which was the customary courtesy. Her father was given nothing that we can point to and say, that was the price. And after a few years it ended, and the king's eye moved on, and Mary went on being Mistress Carey and bearing her husband's children, and the whole thing was folded away into the vast silence that covered such affairs. She had 2 children in those years, a daughter called Catherine and a son called Henry, and there has been an argument ever since about whether they were her husband's or the king's. The dates make it possible that they were the king's. Henry VIII never acknowledged them, as he had acknowledged another mistress's son, and that silence has been read both ways ever since, as proof that they were not his, or as proof that at the moment they were born he had already begun to want something from the Boleyns that made an acknowledged bastard by the elder sister catastrophically inconvenient. We cannot settle it, nobody can, but it hangs there over the story, and it hangs over what happened next, because there is a bleak irony in it that the king himself would later have to explain away. And here I want to say something about Thomas Boleyn and this affair, because it is the foundation of the whole case against him, and it is worth examining. The accusation is that he sold his daughter to the king, that he saw the royal eye light on Mary and pushed her forward and took his profit. And I have to tell you that the evidence for this is not good. What actually happened, so far as the records show, is that his daughter had an affair with the king, and her husband was given some grants, and her father got very little. He was not, in these years, showered with anything. His career advanced at roughly the pace it had been advancing already on the strength of his embassies. The great rewards, the titles, the vast leaps in fortune came later, and they came in connection with the other daughter, and in circumstances entirely different, which does not make him innocent, exactly. It is simply that the crime he is accused of is not quite the crime the evidence supports. He did not, so far as we can tell, sell Mary. What he did was worse and more ordinary. He accepted it. If you want to see the machinery of it, look at what William Carey received. Through the years when his wife was the king's mistress, grants came to him steadily, keeperships and stewardships and manors and offices. the small change of royal favour, worth a good income and costing the crown almost no money. That was how it was done. You did not hand a man a purse for the use of his wife. You gave him the keepership of a park, and everybody understood, and nobody had to say anything, and the whole transaction could be conducted in the language of ordinary patronage with everyone's dignity technically intact. And when Carey died of the sweat in the great epidemic, the grants stopped, as they were always going to, and Mary was left a widow of about 30 with 2 small children and no money, and had to apply to her sister to have her son's wardship secured. That is what being the king's mistress bought her. A husband who was paid in Parkland and then nothing at all. He looked at what was happening to his daughter, understood that nothing could be done, understood that it might be turned to some small profit, and said nothing, and let it happen, and took what came. That is not the conduct of a monster. It is the conduct of a courtier, man who had spent his whole life learning that the king's will is weather, that you do not argue with weather, that you put up your hood and go on. But there is a cost to that habit of mind, and Thomas Boleyn would pay it in full 12 years later in a courtroom. And there is one more thing about this affair, the thing that makes it not merely a scandal but a hinge. Because of Mary, Henry VIII had, in the eyes of the Church, contracted what was called an affinity with the Boleyn family. To sleep with a woman created, in canon law, exactly the same relationship with her family that marriage did. He had made himself, in the technical language of the Church, the brother of Mary's sister, which meant that when he later determined to marry Anne, there was an impediment, a genuine one, of precisely the kind he was at that very moment arguing had invalidated his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, whose sister-in-law he had been. Sit with the shape of that for a moment, because it is almost unbelievable. Henry VIII spent years insisting that his marriage to Catherine was cursed and void because she had been his brother's wife, that no dispensation could make such a union lawful, that the plain word of Scripture forbade it. And at the same time he was demanding a dispensation to marry Anne, whose sister he had slept with, which was the identical impediment in the mirror. He wanted the rule to be iron in one direction and soft in the other, and he got what he wanted, because he was the king. But the whole vast catastrophe of the English Reformation, the break with Rome, the dissolution of 1,000 years of religious life, rests partly on a piece of hypocrisy that began in a bedchamber with Thomas Boleyn's elder daughter. Mary Boleyn is treated by history as a footnote. She was the hinge on which the age turned, and now the other daughter comes home. Anne returned to England in the early months of 1522, after more than a decade abroad, and she came back to a court that had never seen anything like her. She had gone away a child, and she came back a woman of 20 or so, and everything about her was foreign in the most fashionable possible way. She had the French of a native. She had the manners and the carriage of the most sophisticated court in Europe. She dressed differently, and the English women began at once to copy her. She danced and sang and played, and she talked, and it was the talking that did it. She was quick. She was witty in a way that English girls were not encouraged to be, and she had opinions, and she argued, and she had that dangerous glittering charm that comes from a woman who has been raised among clever people and has never been taught to hide her cleverness. She was not, by the standards of the age, a great beauty. Everyone agrees on this, even the people who loved her. She was dark when the fashion was for fair. She was thin when the fashion was for soft. Her eyes were her one universally admitted glory, black and enormous, and by all accounts capable of doing considerable damage. But nobody looking at her thought, "There is the most beautiful woman in England." They thought something else, something harder to name. A hostile Venetian who saw her later, when she was queen, wrote that she was not one of the handsomest women in the world, and then, in the same breath, could not stop talking about her eyes. She had come home to be married, as it happens. Her father had a plan. The plan was Ireland. And since we are looking at her, let us dispose of the wart and the extra finger while we are here, because they are nonsense and they have followed her for centuries. The stories that Anne had a sixth finger on one hand, a great mole on her neck, a projecting tooth, come from a single hostile source written decades after her death by a Catholic exile who never met her, who was writing propaganda, and whose purpose was to establish that she had been visibly marked as a witch and a monster. Nobody who actually saw her mentioned any of it, and a great many people saw her, including ambassadors who loathed her and would have delighted in it. She spent years at the most scrutinizing courts in Europe, and then years at the centre of the English court in gowns designed to display her, and if she had possessed a deformed hand, somebody would have said so at the time. The most that survives from anyone who was there is a mention of a small mark or two of the kind everybody has. She was an ordinary-looking woman with extraordinary eyes and an extraordinary manner, which is a far more frightening thing than a witch, because it means she did it all on her wits. Here we come back to that inheritance, the Ormond earldom, the great disputed prize that Thomas Boleyn had from his mother. He claimed it, a butler cousin in Ireland, Piers Butler, a formidable man on the ground with an army of followers and possession of the actual lands, also claimed it, and had rather better arguments in the practical sense, since he was there and Thomas was not. And somebody at the English court, thinking sensibly, proposed the obvious solution. Marry the two branches together. Let Thomas Boleyn's daughter Anne marry Piers Butler's son James, and the quarrel dissolves, and the earldom passes to their children, and everybody is satisfied. It very nearly happened. The negotiations went on for a couple of years, and if they had succeeded, Anne would have gone to Ireland as the wife of an Irish nobleman, and borne his children, and lived out a long life in obscurity as the Countess of Ormond, and England would never have broken with Rome, and there would have been no Elizabeth, and the whole history of the world would be different. It failed. We do not know quite why. It simply drifted, as these things did, and dissolved, and Anne remained at the English court, unmarried and very visible. And there was another suitor, and this one matters, because it is the one moment in Anne's life when we can see her reaching for something like an ordinary human happiness. His name was Henry Percy, and he was the heir to the earldom of Northumberland, one of the greatest names in the north of England. He was a young man in the household of Cardinal Wolsey, the king's great minister, and he came to court with the cardinal's train, and he and Anne fell in love. And they went further than falling in love. They contracted themselves to one another. They exchanged some form of promise, and in the law of that age a promise between two free people, freely given, was a serious thing, very nearly a marriage in itself, and it was smashed. The cardinal himself broke it. He hauled the boy in and berated him in front of witnesses, told him he was a fool, that his father would never allow it, that he had been promised elsewhere, that he must forget the girl. Percy wept and argued and gave way, as such men did when great men roared at them. His father came south and finished the job. The contract was broken. Percy was married off to the woman his family had chosen, a marriage that turned out to be one of the most spectacularly miserable in the peerage, and Anne was sent home to Hever in disgrace to cool down, and here, the chroniclers tell us, she raged. One of them says she swore that if it ever lay in her power, she would work the cardinal as much displeasure as he had done her. She was at that moment a young woman of no particular consequence, the daughter of a knight, and the man she was cursing was the most powerful subject in England, a prince of the church, who ruled the kingdom in the king's name. It was an absurd thing to say, and within 6 years he was broken, stripped of everything, dying on the road while under arrest for treason, and she was queen. Why did Wolsey do it? That is the question, and there are two answers. They are both interesting. The dull answer is that it was simply what a great man did, that a Percy heir could not be allowed to throw himself away on a knight's daughter, and Wolsey was doing his ordinary job of keeping the young men of his household in order. The other answer, whispered later, is that the king had already noticed her, that the order came from higher up, that Henry VIII, who had had the elder sister and set her aside, had begun to look at the younger one and did not intend to see her married to somebody else. We cannot know, but we do know that within a very short time the king was pursuing Anne with a single-mindedness that would change the world, and that her father, watching all of this, had a decision to make that was not really a decision at all. What happened next is the most famous courtship in English history, and I am not going to retell all of it, because you know it, and because we are here for the father and not for the daughter. But we must understand its shape, because everything that happened to Thomas Boleyn for the next 10 years happened because of it. The king fell in love with Anne Boleyn, not in the way he had fallen for her sister, or for the other women who had passed through his bed and out again. This was something else, an obsession, a fixation of the most consuming kind, and we can watch it happen because his letters to her survive. That in itself is remarkable. Henry VIII loathed writing. He was a man who avoided the pen whenever a secretary could be found to hold it for him, and yet here he is with his own hand, writing love letters to a young woman, complaining that he has not heard from her, telling her he has been above a 12-month struck by the dart of love, begging her to give him an answer. 17 of those letters survive, and they are in the Vatican Library, stolen at some point by somebody who understood exactly how valuable they would be, and they are one of the strangest documents in European history. The most powerful man in England pleading with a girl, and she said no. That is the extraordinary thing, and it is worth pausing on, because everything else follows from it. Anne Boleyn refused to become the king's mistress. She had watched what happened to her sister, watched her used and set aside, and left with a reputation and nothing else, and she declined. She would not be that. And she held that line for years, through the letters and the gifts and the pleading and the pressure of the most dangerous man in the kingdom, and it drove him into a state approaching madness, and out of that madness came everything: the divorce, the break with Rome, the destruction of 1,000 years of English faith, the executions, the dissolution, the whole terrible upheaval of the English Reformation, because a young woman would not say yes, and we should be honest about what that cost her, because the story is usually told as though refusing were a clever tactic and nothing more. She was in her 20s. She spent 6 of the best years of her life in a state of suspended animation, unable to marry anybody else, unable to leave, watched by the entire court, hated by half of it, waiting on the outcome of a legal process in Rome over which she had no control whatever, with her whole future, and her family's resting on a decision that kept not being made. She had already had one engagement smashed. She could not go home, and she could not go forward. And all the while the woman she was waiting to replace was still there, at court, at table, serving as queen, sewing the king's shirts, and Anne had to be in the room. 6 winters of that. Whatever else Anne Boleyn was, she had nerve of a kind that is almost frightening to contemplate. And she held that position against the pressure of the most powerful man in England, and the loathing of a whole country, and she won. And then she had 35 months. Now, where is her father in all this? The popular story says he was the engine of it, that he saw the king's infatuation and drove his daughter forward, coached her, schemed with her, made her hold out for the crown. It is a wonderful story, and it makes for magnificent drama, and there is essentially no evidence for it at all. What the evidence shows is a man being carried along. Thomas Boleyn was abroad for a good deal of the crucial period, doing his job, going on embassies. When he is in the record during these years, he is doing what he had always done, negotiating for the crown, and it happens that what he was now negotiating for was his own daughter's marriage to the king, which must have been the strangest professional assignment ever handed to an English diplomat. He was sent to the emperor. He was sent to the Pope's people. He was sent to argue the king's case for setting aside a wife he had been married to for 2 decades. And the woman the king wished to marry instead was his own child. There is no precedent for that in the whole history of diplomacy, and if he found it uncomfortable, he never said so, because a man in his position did not say so. But I do not think he drove it. I think he was terrified of it. Think about what this looked like from inside. You are a courtier. You have spent 30 years learning that the first rule of survival is not to be conspicuous, not to be indispensable, not to be the subject of the king's strong emotions in any direction whatever. Now the King of England has fallen violently in love with your daughter and will not be dissuaded, and the whole court is watching you, and half of it hates you already. There is no way out. You cannot tell him no. Nobody tells him no. You cannot marry her to somebody else. They tried that, and he broke it. You cannot send her away. He will send for her. Nor can you stand still, because standing still in that situation is itself a choice, and it will be read as one. So you do the only thing that a man of his training could do. You go with it. You put your family behind the thing that is happening anyway, and you try to steer it. And you take the rewards as they come, because refusing them would be conspicuous. And you tell yourself that if it works, if she becomes queen, then your family is made forever, and your grandson sits on the throne of England, and everything you and your father and your grandfather ever built is crowned. There is one more point, and it is the thing everyone forgets. It was working. For 6 years it looked like a catastrophe, and then it worked. Whatever we think of Thomas Boleyn's judgment, we have to admit that the bet came in. His daughter did become Queen of England. His grandchild was born in the purple. The mercer's great-great-grandson was the grandfather of the heir to the throne. No family in English history had ever climbed so far so fast, and for a few years, from about the time of the coronation to that last spring, Thomas Boleyn stood at a height no Englishman of his origins had ever stood at, and it must have seemed to him that everything, all of it, every calculation and every risk had been justified, and in the middle of it, the woman at the centre was his own child, and I wonder, sometimes, what he made of her. Because she was not a piece being moved, she was doing this herself, with a nerve and a will that outmatched every man around her. She had refused a king for a long time. She had faced down the greatest minister in England and destroyed him. She was arguing theology with bishops and reading forbidden books and pressing the king toward the break with Rome. And she was, when she chose to be, absolutely ruthless. Her father had sent a clever little girl to Mechlin 2 decades before, and what came back was something none of them could control, least of all him. He must have been proud. He must, at some point, in some dark hour, have been frightened. He had made a weapon, and he had aimed it at the throne of England, and it had hit, and now it was going to be very difficult indeed to put it down. The rewards came, and when they came they were spectacular. In 1525 Thomas Boleyn was raised to the peerage as Viscount Rochford. That was the first great leap, and we should be careful with it, because it is the one that is most often misread. It came before the king's pursuit of Anne had become the great public business of the reign. It came at a moment when the king was ennobling several of his servants at once, including his own illegitimate son, and it looked, at the time, like what it largely was, the natural reward of a distinguished career. Thomas Boleyn had been a Knight of the Garter for 2 years, an ambassador for a decade, one of the Crown's most reliable men for 20. He was going to be given a peerage sooner or later, and so he became a viscount, and stopped being Sir Thomas and became my lord. And the Boleyns crossed the line that separates the gentry from the nobility of England, a line their family had been walking toward for 4 generations. And then, in the last month of 1529, came the thunderclap. On a single day, in a single ceremony, he was created Earl of Wiltshire and Earl of Ormond, 2 earldoms at once. And on the same day, his son George, a young man barely into his 20s, was given his father's old title of Viscount Rochford, which was the customary courtesy for the heir of an earl. In one afternoon, the family went from a viscountcy to a double earldom, with a courtesy title for the heir, and their father became one of the great magnates of England, ranking with the ancient houses, sitting among the earls in the House of Lords, addressed as one of the first men of the realm. The Ormond earldom, I hope you will notice, was the one he had been fighting for, the claim he had from his mother, the ancient Irish inheritance, the thing that had eluded him for decades against the determined resistance of Piers Butler, who was on the ground in Ireland, with the lands and the men and the better practical case. And now, suddenly, it was simply given to him. The king took it away from the man who held it and handed it over. There is no dressing that up. That was the price. Whatever else was earned, that was bought, and everybody knew it. Piers Butler was compensated with another title and told to be quiet, and a claim that 30 years of law and lobbying had not been able to make good was settled in an afternoon because the king wanted to please the father of the woman he intended to marry. If you want the single clearest piece of evidence that Thomas Boleyn profited from his daughter, it is not Mary, and it is not any grubby transaction in a bedchamber. It is this: an Irish earldom transferred by royal fiat because of Anne, and the next 12 months brought the office. Thomas Boleyn was made Lord Privy Seal, and that was not a decoration, that was one of the great offices of state, a place in the innermost councils of the kingdom, one of the handful of men who actually ran England. He held it for 6 years. He sat on the council. He was in the room where it happened, every time it happened, through the most consequential decade in 1,000 years of English history. It is worth knowing what that office actually was, because the name sounds like a joke to us now, and it was nothing of the kind. The Privy Seal was one of the 3 great seals of the kingdom, and nothing of consequence could be done without it. A grant, a commission, a payment out of the treasury, an order to an ambassador, all of it had to pass under that seal to have force, and the man who kept it saw everything. He was, by the nature of the job, in the innermost circle, present at the council, party to every secret the government had, and the 6 years he held it were the ones in which England broke with Rome, declared its king the supreme head of the church, executed a chancellor and a bishop for refusing to agree, and began the dissolution of the monasteries. He was in the room for all of it. Whatever we decide about him tonight, we cannot decide that he was a bystander. He was one of the dozen or so men who did it. So let us take a moment and look at him at the summit, because he had reached it, and it is worth seeing. Here is a man in his mid-50s. He is Earl of Wiltshire and Earl of Ormond. He is a Knight of the Garter. He is Lord Privy Seal of England. He is the son-in-law of the Duke of Norfolk. He is the father of the Queen of England, and of a Viscount, and the grandfather of the King's heir. He has houses in Kent and Norfolk and Essex, lands in a dozen counties, an income that would have staggered his father. He can walk into any room in England and be given the best chair in it, and every single bit of it, from the shop in Cheapside to the Earl's coronet, has been built in 4 generations by a family that simply refused to stop climbing. If Thomas Boleyn had died in, let us say 1534, he would be remembered, insofar as anyone remembered him at all, as one of the great success stories of the Tudor age. the self-made man's grandson who made himself again, the diplomat who served 2 kings, the father of a queen. There would be a stately portrait somewhere, and a paragraph in the reference books, and nothing but respect. He did not die in 1534. He lived another 5 years, and in the middle of them there were 17 days that took all of it away. But before we go there, I want to spend a little time in the good years, because they were good, and because there is one thing in them that we have not looked at, and it is the strangest and most human episode in the whole of his life. It concerns his wife and a rumour, and the only recorded occasion on which Henry VIII ever defended the honour of a Boleyn. There was a rumour. It went round the court, and it went round the embassies, and it found its way into the dispatches of foreign ambassadors, and it was this: that the king had not only had both of Thomas Boleyn's daughters, but their mother as well, that Elizabeth Howard in her youth had been Henry's mistress too, and that Anne Boleyn was therefore not Thomas Boleyn's daughter at all, but the king's own child, and that the marriage the king was moving heaven and earth to make was not merely irregular, but monstrous. It was a filthy piece of work, and it was entirely deliberate. You can see the machinery of it if you look. The people spreading it were the people who wanted the marriage stopped, the friends of Catherine of Aragon, the imperial party, the conservatives who could see where all this was heading and were desperate to head it off. And they had worked out, quite shrewdly, that the one thing that might turn the king aside was horror. He had built his entire case for setting aside Catherine on the grounds that he had unknowingly committed a sin against the laws of God by marrying his brother's widow, that his conscience was in torment, that his lack of sons was divine punishment. Very well then, answered his enemies, let his conscience chew on this. Let him be told that the woman he wants is his own flesh. It was a lie. The chronology alone makes it nonsense, and nobody who repeated it seems to have believed it very hard. But it was in the air, and it was being repeated, and it was being put about concerning a woman who had been married to the same man for 30 years and had nothing whatever to do with any of it. And Henry VIII answered it. That is the part I find remarkable. Somebody, at some point, put it to him, or he heard it repeated, and he responded, and his answer has come down to us. He said, never with the mother. Never with the mother. 4 words, and they tell us a great deal. They tell us, first and most obviously, that the rumour was false, and that he was denying it flatly. But look at what he does not deny. He does not say, never with any of them, nor does he protest, how dare you slander the family of my future wife. He confirms, by the shape of his denial, exactly what everybody already knew and nobody was supposed to mention, which is that he had indeed had Mary. He draws a line under the mother, and leaves the daughters standing on the other side of it, and thinks nothing of it, because in his world there was nothing to think about. Now put yourself where Elizabeth Howard was standing. Of everything in this long tale, this is the place where my sympathy goes out hardest and with the least reservation. She is a woman in her late 40s or so. She is a Howard of the first blood in England. She has been married to Thomas Boleyn for the whole of her adult life, and borne him 5 children and buried 2 of them. And now, in the last years of her life, she has to live in a country where it is being repeated openly by important people in writing that she slept with the king, and that her daughter is the product of it. She has to walk into rooms knowing what has been whispered. She has to hear her own name in that context, and the man who could have crushed the rumour with a word crushes it with 4 words that simultaneously clear her and confirm that he had her elder daughter. Nobody asked her what she thought. Nobody wrote it down if she answered at all. She simply had to endure it, as she had to endure everything else that was happening to her family, silently from the sidelines, watching her daughters be consumed by a process she had no power whatever to stop. And what was Thomas Boleyn doing while his wife's name was being dragged through the courts of Europe? Nothing that we can see. There is no record of him defending her. No letter, no protest, no challenge. Perhaps there was nothing to be done, and probably there was not, for you cannot fight a rumour, and to answer it publicly is to give it life. But it is one more silence in a marriage full of silences, and it sits there. I told you earlier that I could not say whether these two people loved one another, and I still cannot. But let me give you what there is, because there is a little. They stayed together 40 years and not one whisper of a separation, not one hint of estrangement, in a world where great couples lived apart as a matter of course, and nobody thought anything of it. He kept no acknowledged mistress that anybody recorded, which for a courtier of his rank and opportunities is not nothing at all. She stayed at court and served the queens of England, and was at the great occasions, and he was at the great occasions, and they must have stood beside one another at 100 ceremonies over 4 decades. They raised 3 children to adulthood, which was more than many managed. And at the end, when their world had burned down, they were together at Hever, 2 old people in an empty house, and when she died he lived less than a year without her. I put it no higher than that. But I noticed that when everything else was gone, the titles and the offices and the children and the future, the one thing that was still standing was the marriage, and it stood until she died. And the silence is not evidence of coldness, which is the trap we always fall into. We have almost no private letters from any Tudor marriage, because private letters between husband and wife were not kept. They were not state papers. Nobody filed them. They were read and thrown on the fire, and what survives from that century survives mostly because it passed through an office. So when we say that we have no evidence that he loved his wife, we should be honest that we would not expect to have any, and that the same silence covers 100 marriages we know perfectly well were happy. What we have instead are the shapes people's lives make, and the shape of theirs is 2 people who stayed in the same house for 4 decades through the best fortune and the worst that this world can hand out, and who died within a year of each other. That is not proof of anything. It is simply the only kind of evidence this century leaves us, and I would not throw it away. Let us go now to the summit, to the day that all of it had been for, because in the summer of 1533, Thomas Boleyn walked into Westminster Abbey and watched his daughter be crowned Queen of England. It was the first day of June, and it was the greatest day the Boleyn family would ever know. The coronation of Anne Boleyn was staged on a scale that England had not seen for generations, and it was staged that way deliberately, because it had to be. This was not merely a crowning, it was an argument. Half the country thought this woman was no queen at all, that the real queen was Catherine of Aragon, living in exile in a damp house in the country, and that the child in Anne Boleyn's belly, already showing, was a bastard. So the coronation had to overwhelm. It had to be so magnificent, so unanswerable, so soaked in ceremony and gold and precedent, that nobody could look at it and say, that is not real. They brought her up the river from Greenwich in a procession of barges, hundreds of them, the whole city on the water, music playing, guns firing from the tower, and she came ashore and was lodged in state. They processed her through London in an open litter of cloth of gold, dressed in white, her hair loose down her back as a queen's should be at her crowning, under a canopy carried by the barons of the Cinque Ports, through streets hung with tapestry and running, at the conduits, with wine. And then, in the abbey, before the peers of England and the bishops and the whole assembled power of the kingdom, she was anointed with holy oil and crowned with the crown of St. Edward, which was the crown used for reigning monarchs and not for consorts, a detail that nobody has ever quite explained, and that must have been meant to say something. Her father was there. Of course he was there. He had a place among the very greatest men in that abbey, by right of every title he had spent his life gathering, and he watched his daughter, the girl he had sent away to Mechelen a quarter of a century before, be crowned Queen of England. And the city, we should note, was sullen. That is the detail the pageantry cannot cover. The streets were hung and the wine ran, and the pageants were staged at every conduit, and the Londoners came out and looked, and did not cheer. There is a story which may be true, or may be the sort of thing that gets improved in the telling, that as she passed, the caps stayed on the heads, and that her fools shouted at the crowd that they all had scurvy heads, and dared not uncover. Whether or not anybody said it, the silence itself is well attested. London had loved Catherine of Aragon, who had been their queen for 24 years, a good woman by any account. They knew perfectly well what had been done to her and by whom, and so the greatest day of the Boleyn family unrolled through streets of people who were for the most part keeping their mouths shut. Her father, riding in that procession in his robes, would have seen every one of those faces, and he had spent his life reading rooms for a living. And I want to stop here at the very top of the mountain and let us look out, because think about what he was seeing. 4 generations. His great-grandfather was a Norfolk tenant. His grandfather sold cloth in a London shop and became Lord Mayor and bought 2 estates. His father married an earl's daughter and lived like a gentleman. He himself married a Howard and served 2 kings and won the Garter and 2 earldoms, and now his daughter was wearing the crown of St. Edward, and there was a child coming, and if that child was a boy, then the blood of the Cheapside mercer would sit on the throne of England forever. Every calculation his family had ever made, every marriage, each careful step, each pound put into land instead of pleasure, had led to this room, this hour, this girl with the oil on her forehead. Nobody in English history had ever climbed like that. Nobody. There is no other family that goes from the counter to the crown in 4 generations, and he was standing in the abbey watching it happen, and he was 56 years old, and he had done it. I think we owe him that moment. Whatever comes next, and something terrible comes next, he had that hour, and he had earned some of it, and bought some of it, and got lucky with a great deal of it, and it must have been the most extraordinary feeling available to a human being. His child was queen. The child, when it came in September, was a girl. They called her Elizabeth. And you can feel the whole court's disappointment across 5 centuries. The hastily amended letters announcing the birth of a prince with an C squeezed in at the end. The cancelled tournament. But nobody panicked. Not yet. The king was disappointed, but not alarmed. Anne was young and evidently fertile, and the girl was healthy, and there would be sons. Everyone said so. There would be sons next time. He was now the grandfather of the heir to the throne of England, and he stood godfather at that christening in the person of his own greatness, and the future of his family was assured for 1,000 years. It lasted 35 months. That is what gets me about this story, every time I come back to it. The Boleyn ascendancy, the thing 4 generations had built toward, the enterprise that broke a nation's religion and set England on a road that changed the world, lasted less than 3 years from the coronation to the scaffold, 35 months. Anne Boleyn was Queen of England for a shorter time than most people hold a job, and her father, who had climbed for 5 decades to get there, had 35 months at the summit before the ground opened, and it began to go wrong almost at once. And the first thing that went wrong had nothing to do with the king at all. It was a quarrel in the family, and it was about the one thing the Boleyns had never had any use for, which was love. In September of 1534, Mary came to court, and she was pregnant, and she was not married to anybody that her family knew of, except that she was. She had married in secret, some months before, a man called William Stafford, and when I tell you who he was, you will understand why the family reacted as they did. He was a younger son. He was a soldier of the Calais garrison. He was of decent gentry stock, related distantly to grander Staffords, but he was a second son, with no land and no fortune and no prospects, and he was, by the best reckoning, some 12 years younger than she was. He had nothing. He was, in the vocabulary of that world, nobody. Mary Boleyn, the sister of the Queen of England, the daughter of an earl, a woman whose family could have married her to almost anyone in the kingdom, had married him without a word to anybody, for no reason at all, except that she wanted to. The family's reaction was total. Anne, who was queen, was incandescent and banished her from court, and her father cut her off. He stopped her allowance, closed his doors, and would not have her name mentioned. She was disowned comprehensively by the whole of her blood, and she and her young husband went away into poverty and obscurity, and that was that. Now, we have a letter. Mary Boleyn wrote to Thomas Cromwell some 3 months later, when the money had run out and the reality of what she had done was beginning to bite, and it is the only real thing in her own voice that survives from her whole life. And I am going to tell you what is in it, because it is the emotional centre of this entire evening. She asks Cromwell to intercede. She is frightened and she is poor and she needs help, and she writes of her husband that he was young and that love overcame reason, and that she saw so much honesty in him that she loved him as well as he loved her. She had been in bondage, she tells him, and was glad to be at liberty. All the world set so little by her, and he so much, that she could take no better way than to take him. And then comes the line that I would have carved on her grave if anybody knew where it was. She would rather beg her bread with him, she says, than be the greatest queen in Christendom. Her sister was the greatest queen in Christendom. She knew exactly what she was saying and to whom, and she said it anyway. And there is one more line in that letter, and it is the one that concerns us tonight, because it is about her father. She says of her family that she dare not write to them. They are so cruel against us. And read the rest of that line, because there is a detail in it that goes past very fast, and should not. She asks Cromwell to speak to my Lord Norfolk and my lord my brother. Norfolk is her uncle, the Duke. Her brother is George. She is asking a stranger to approach her own uncle and her own brother on her behalf, because she cannot approach them herself. That is the state of things inside the most successful family in England at the height of its power. A daughter of the house cannot write to her brother. Everything had been subordinated to the enterprise for so long, every relationship converted into a position, that when one of them stepped out of line, the family simply closed like a door, and there was nothing underneath the arrangement, no ordinary affection left over that could survive the breach. And within 2 years the brother she dared not write to was dead on Tower Hill, and so was the sister whose anger she was afraid of, and the letter that had gone unanswered was the last exchange any of them ever had. She dare not write to her own father. She is a woman of 35, pregnant, penniless, appealing to a stranger for help, because she cannot bring herself to write to her own family, because they are so cruel. That is Thomas Boleyn from the outside. That is the view from the daughter he threw away, and I do not think there is any way to soften it, and I am not going to try. But let me at least explain it, because there is an explanation, and it is not the one you would expect. It was not, I think, primarily about the money or the rank, although both mattered. It was about what Mary had done to Anne. Look at the timing. That autumn, Anne was in the worst trouble of her reign so far. She had had her daughter, and then she had lost a child, and the king was beginning to look elsewhere, and the whole edifice of the family's fortune was resting on her ability to produce a son, and she had not produced one. Every enemy the Boleyns had, and they had a great many, was watching for weakness. And into that moment walked Mary, visibly pregnant, having married a nobody in secret, making the Queen's own family seem ridiculous and immoral and out of control at exactly the moment when they needed to look untouchable. Mary had, without meaning to, handed their enemies a stick. And she had done something else, something that in the Boleyn family's terms was almost incomprehensible. She had put her own happiness first. She had taken the one asset the family had left in her, which was her marriageability as the Queen's sister, and spent it on a soldier she liked, because she wanted to be happy. They could not forgive that. Not because they were monsters, but because in the world they had built in the family enterprise that had climbed from a shop to a throne in 4 generations by never once putting the individual before the lineage, what Mary did was heresy. It was a repudiation of everything the Boleyns were. Her father had spent 5 decades subordinating everything to the family's advance, and his daughter had looked at all of it and said, "I would rather beg my bread with him. And here is the ending of it, the thing that makes it unbearable." Mary Boleyn was the only one of his children who survived him. Within 2 years the other 2 were dead. And she was there, disowned, cast out, living in obscurity somewhere with her soldier, while her father sat at Hever with nothing left. Whether they ever spoke again, we do not know. There is a suggestion that after the catastrophe he allowed the Staffords the use of a house in Essex, which may be the closest thing to reconciliation the record permits, a father who could not say sorry but could hand over a set of keys. What became of the appeal we do not exactly know. Cromwell seems to have done something, or somebody did, because the Staffords were not left to starve, and the Queen was eventually persuaded to send her sister a gold cup and some money, which is a very Tudor sort of forgiveness, expensive and wordless, and delivered by a servant. But Anne never received her again, and the 2 sisters, so far as anyone can tell, never met after that autumn. Whatever passed between them in their girlhood at Hever and their years in France, and the strange decade when one of them had the king and then the other took him, ended in a gold cup handed over by a third party, and then silence, and then the Tower. I think about that a good deal. The one who was thrown away for choosing love was the only one it worked out for. That is not a moral, exactly. The world does not hand out lessons that neatly. But it is a fact, and it sits in this story like a stone. Now we come to the turning, and I want to lay it out carefully, because the speed of what happened is the thing that nobody quite believes when they first hear it. In the January of 1536, 2 things happened within 3 weeks of one another, and between them they killed the Boleyns. The first was that Catherine of Aragon died. She had been in exile for year upon year, moved from one damp house to another, denied her title, denied her daughter, and she went to her grave still insisting that she was the king's true wife. The court celebrated. The king dressed in yellow and paraded his baby daughter about, and there was dancing, and everybody thought this was wonderful news for Anne, because the rival was gone, because now there could be no argument, because the woman whose existence had made her marriage questionable in the eyes of Europe was in her grave. It was the worst possible news for Anne, and it took a little while for anyone to see why. While Catherine lived, the king could not get rid of Anne. Think it through. If he set Anne aside, the entire world would say, "Good, now go back to your real wife." Every power in Europe, every bishop, the emperor, the pope, would insist on it, and he would have to take Catherine back or fight them all over again. Anne was safe precisely because the only alternative to her was a woman Henry would sooner have died than return to. Catherine was Anne's shield. And then Catherine died, and the shield was gone, and suddenly there was a clear space where a third wife could stand. The second thing happened at the end of that same month. The king was jousting, and he fell. He went down in full armour with the horse on top of him, and he lay unconscious for a long time, long enough that they thought he was dead, and the news was carried to the Queen, and a few days later, Anne miscarried. The child was far enough on that they could tell, and it was a boy. She lost a son. On the day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral, as it happens, which is the kind of thing that would be too much if you put it in a story. And that was the end. Everything after that was mechanism. Because Henry VIII, who had broken with Rome and torn up 1,000 years of English faith and made himself head of the church, had done all of it for one reason, which was to get a son. And here was the second wife, the wife he had wrecked the world for, and she had given him a girl and then a dead boy, exactly as the first wife had done. And the king's mind, which had a genius for finding divine judgment in his own misfortunes, began to work. He had told himself for 2 decades that his first marriage was cursed by God. Now, when the second one produced the same result, there was only one conclusion a man like that could reach, and he reached it. This marriage was cursed too. He had been deceived, entrapped, bewitched into it. It was not lawful. God was telling him so in the only language God spoke to Henry VIII, which was the language of dead sons. And there was a young woman at court called Jane Seymour, quiet, where Anne was loud, mild, where Anne was fierce, and she had been coached, and she was saying no to the king in exactly the way Anne had said no a decade before, and the whole grim machinery began to turn again. Now, whereas Thomas Boleyn in the winter and spring of that year, as the ground opens under his family, he is on the council. He is Lord Privy Seal. He is in the rooms where this is being discussed, or where it is being carefully not discussed. And he is a man of enormous experience in reading the weather of that court. And he must have known. He must have seen it coming from a long way off, the way a sailor sees the sky change, the king's coldness, the Seymours being pushed forward, his own enemies who were legion growing bolder, Cromwell, who had been the family's ally and was now, quietly, becoming something else. Cromwell deserves a moment here, because the change in him is the mechanism of the whole disaster. He had been the Boleyn's man, in effect, for years. He had risen with them, built the legal architecture of the break with Rome that had made Anne queen, and been their ally in every fight. And then he and Anne had fallen out, hard, over money. The monasteries were being dissolved, and there was a mountain of wealth coming in, and Anne wanted it spent on education and charity and the reform of the church, which was what she had always said the break was for. Cromwell wanted it in the king's treasury, which was what the king wanted. She preached at him about it, in public, through her almoner, in a sermon that everybody understood. And Cromwell, who was the most dangerous administrator in English history, took the measure of the situation and concluded that one of the two of them was going to have to go, and that it was not going to be him. He went to the king, and he found a king who was already halfway there, and between them, in a matter of weeks, they built the machine. He said afterwards, more or less openly, that he had thought it up and set it going himself. He was proud of it. And he did nothing, or rather he did what he had always done, which was to keep his head down, attend the council, do his job, and wait to see which way it would fall. He did not go to the king and plead for his daughter. He did not rally the family. He did not, so far as any record shows, lift a finger. Could he have? That is the question I keep turning over, and I have to be honest with you and say I do not think he could. Consider what he was up against. This was Henry VIII in the grip of one of his conversions, and there was no arguing with the man in that state, and everyone who ever tried it died. Thomas More tried, in his way, and was executed. Cardinal Wolsey, who had been closer to that king than any man alive, fell and would have died had the road not killed him first. Cromwell himself, the cleverest man in England, would go to the block within 4 years. Nobody survived opposing that king when he had decided. Nobody. but there is a difference between could not save her and did not try. And whatever the truth of it, what the record shows is a father who watched the machine come for his daughter and his son, and stood aside and let it pass over them, and then did something worse. It took 17 days. On the last of April, a court musician called Mark Smeaton was taken to a house in Stepney and questioned, and by the next morning he had confessed to adultery with the Queen. On the 1st of May, the King walked out of a tournament without a word to anybody and rode to London and never saw Anne Boleyn again. On the 2nd, she was arrested and taken by barge to the Tower, and her brother George was arrested within hours of her. Over that week, 4 other men were taken. On the 12th, the commoners among them were tried and convicted. On the 15th, Anne and George were tried in the great hall of the Tower before their peers. On the 17th, the men died, and on the 19th of May, on a scaffold within the Tower, Anne Boleyn was executed by a swordsman brought over from Calais for the purpose. 17 days from the first arrest to the last death. The whole family, everything, gone inside 3 weeks. The charges were adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, and conspiring the king's death. And I want to say this as plainly as I can, because it matters. Almost no serious historian believes any of it. The dates given in the indictment are, in several cases, demonstrably impossible days when she was somewhere else, or days when she had just given birth and was in seclusion. The evidence was confession under duress from one frightened musician, and nothing else whatever. The charge of incest with her brother rested, so far as anyone can tell, on the testimony that he had once been alone in a room with her, which he had because he was her brother. And spare a thought, while we are here, for the 4 other men, because they are the forgotten dead of this story, and they had families too. Henry Norris was one of the king's closest friends, the man who kept the door of his bedchamber, who had known him for 20 years. He was offered his life, it is said, if he would confess, and he refused, and said the Queen was innocent, and died for it. Francis Weston was a young man of about 25, whose family offered an enormous fortune for his life, and were refused. William Brereton was a Cheshire gentleman, who seems to have been swept in because Cromwell had separate reasons for wanting him gone. And Mark Smeaton, the musician, the only one who confessed, was the only one of the 5 who was not a gentleman, which is almost certainly why he was the one they questioned in a way that produced a confession. 5 men died for a thing that did not happen, and one of the judges who sent 4 of them to it was the father of the woman they were supposed to have done it with. It was a fabrication. It was quick, and it was efficient, and it was a lie. And everyone in that hall knew it was a lie, and it did not matter in the smallest degree, because the king wanted it. And now I have to tell you where Thomas Boleyn was during those 17 days. He was on the commission. He was one of the judges. When the 4 commoners were tried at Westminster on the 12th of May, the special commission of Oyer and Terminer appointed to hear the case included, among the great men of the realm, the Earl of Wiltshire. Their father, he sat on the bench, and he heard the evidence against the men accused of sleeping with his daughter, and he found them guilty, and they were condemned to die. That is a fact. It is not a rumour or a hostile invention. He was there, his name is on the commission, and he sat in judgment. He was spared the last horror. When it came to the trial of Anne and George 3 days later, the trial of his own children, he was not among the peers who tried them. He was excused, or he excused himself, or somebody had the decency to arrange it. His brother-in-law, the Duke of Norfolk, presided, and wept, they say, when he passed sentence on his own niece. But Thomas Boleyn was not in that hall. He had sat in judgment on the men accused with them, and then he was allowed to go. How do we understand this? I have thought about it a great deal, and I want to offer you 2 ways of seeing it, and I am not going to tell you which one is right, because I do not know. The first is the obvious one, the one that has damned him for 5 centuries. He was a coward and a careerist. When the storm came, he did the arithmetic he had been doing his whole life, and he calculated that his children were lost, and that the only thing that could still be saved was himself. And he chose to be seen publicly and unmistakably on the king's side. He sat on that bench so that the whole court could see him sitting on it, so that no man could ever say that the Earl of Wiltshire had wavered. He purchased his own survival with the last shred of his dignity, and he sat and condemned men he knew to be innocent. And he did it in front of everybody. That is one reading, and the evidence supports it. And if it is true, then it is one of the coldest things any father has ever done. The second reading is this: he had no choice. To refuse a summons to that commission was itself treason, or near enough. It was to declare publicly that you did not accept the king's version of events, and everyone who did that died. And he had a wife. He had another daughter, disowned but living. He had grandchildren, Mary's children, small and vulnerable. If he had stood up in that court and said no, he would not have saved Anne, not by 1 hour, and he would have been arrested within the day, and the attainder would have swept away everything, and every Boleyn left alive would have gone down with him. Refusing would have been magnificent, and it would have been futile, and it would have killed everyone. So he sat there and put his name to a lie, and hated himself, and saved what could be saved. I lean, if I am honest, towards something in between. I think he was a man who had spent 5 decades learning one skill, which was how to survive the weather of that court, and when the worst storm of his life came, he did the only thing he knew how to do, and it happened to be monstrous, and he probably did not permit himself, in that moment, to think about it too closely. Men are very good at not thinking about things too closely when the alternative is unbearable. But here is what I keep coming back to. Whatever he told himself in that courtroom, he had to live afterwards. He had to get up the next morning, and the morning after that. And on the 17th, his son George, whom he had raised, whom he had made a viscount at 20, went to the block on Tower Hill. And 2 days after that, on the 19th, his daughter Anne, the clever little girl he had sent to Mechelen, who had learned her French and her music and her wit, and come home and taken a king, and worn the crown of St. Edward in Westminster Abbey, knelt on a scaffold, and was killed with a sword. She was buried the same day in an arrow chest, because nobody had thought to provide a coffin under the floor of the chapel inside the tower. There is one detail of that execution that I have never been able to put down, and it belongs here. Anne Boleyn was not killed with an axe. The English executioner used an axe, and it was a heavy, brutal, frequently botched instrument that took 2 blows or 3, or, in one notorious case some years later, 11. Instead, a swordsman was brought over from Calais, an expert, a man who did it cleanly with a single stroke, and who was paid handsomely for the crossing. And here is the thing: he had to be sent for. It takes days to fetch a man from Calais, which means that the order for the swordsman went out before her trial, before the peers of England had heard one word of evidence, before the verdict, before the sentence. Somebody in the king's government had already written to Calais to book the executioner. Everything that happened in that hall on the 15th of May was theatre. The ending had been arranged the week before, and I think that fact tells us more about what Thomas Boleyn could and could not have done for his daughter than any amount of arguing about his courage. Nobody was going to save her. The sword was already on the road. Her brother lies near her, under the same floor. And their father was alive and free and 60 years old, and had helped. And then there was the silence. I want to spend this hour in it, because nobody ever does. Every account of the Boleyns races to the scaffold and stops there, as though the story ended on the 19th of May, and it did not. Two people walked out of that spring and had to go on living, and they were Thomas Boleyn and his wife, and they had another 2.5 years of mournings to get through. Let us be precise about what he lost, and how fast. He lost his son and his daughter within 2 days of one another. He lost, at the same stroke, his heir, which in the terms of his world meant he lost the future, because George had no children, and there was now no Boleyn boy anywhere to carry the name. 4 generations of climbing, and the line simply stopped. He lost his granddaughter, in a sense, because the little girl Elizabeth was declared a bastard within weeks, her mother's marriage annulled, and she was moved out to the country, and became an awkwardness whose gowns nobody wanted to pay for. He lost the office. He surrendered the Privy Seal that summer, and it went to Cromwell, who had built the case that killed his children. And that must have been a particular sort of hell to hand the seal of your office across to that man and bow. He lost the earldom of Ormond in effect, if not immediately the great inheritance he had spent 30 years fighting for, which slid back toward the butlers because the only reason he had ever been given it was now dead. And he lost his position, his consequence, the thing he had spent his whole life accumulating, because a courtier without the king's favour is nothing at all, a man other men look through. And he went to Hever. Picture that house now. Picture it as we saw it at the start of the evening, with the moat and the gatehouse and the gardens and the swans, and the children running in it. And picture it in the summer that followed, with 2 people in it, an old man and his wife, and every room in it full of the children who were dead. That is what I cannot get past. He went home to the house where he had raised them, the rooms where Anne had learned her letters, the gardens where George had played, the chapel across the field where the family were buried. That house was not neutral ground. It was a museum of everything he had lost, and he went there, and he lived in it for the rest of his life, and so did she. What did they say to one another? I would give a great deal to know. Here is a woman who has lost 2 children in 3 days, and here is the man she has been married to for nearly 4 decades, and he sat on the bench. He put his name to it. Did she know? Of course she did. The whole of England knew. Did she blame him? Did she understand? Did they talk about it once? Terribly, and then never again for 2.5 years. Did she come down to dinner? Did they sit at either end of a table in a hall hung with the falcon badge and eat in silence? There is not one word of it anywhere. Not a letter, not a report, not a scrap. The record simply goes dark. And into that darkness I can only tell you what I think, which is that whatever was between them, it held, because they were together at the end, and neither of them went anywhere else. And there is one detail from these years, and it is small, and it is strange, and I think it is the most human thing in the whole of Thomas Boleyn's life. He got them back. Not the children, obviously, but listen. In the wake of the fall, Cromwell's men went through the family's houses, and one of the items they took away, because it was valuable, and because it was politic, and because the family were finished, were the books. Anne's books. She had been a great collector, a woman with a real library, French poetry and reformist theology, and beautifully made volumes, the whole intellectual apparatus of a woman who had been raised in the most cultivated courts in Europe by a father who had wanted her to be clever. And after her death, some of them at least, came back into her father's hands. And there is a copy of one of her books that carries his mark that can be traced to him in the years after. He kept her books. The man who sat on the commission went home to Hever and kept his dead daughter's books in his house. I cannot prove what that means. It may have been nothing, an inventory, an asset, a piece of property recovered by a man who was recovering what he could, but I do not think so. A man who wanted to forget does not keep the library. I think a man who was purely calculating burns them, because in that season, owning the books of the attainted traitor Anne Boleyn was not a clever thing to do. It was a risk, and it bought him nothing at all. I think he kept them because she had been his. There is a coda to the house itself that belongs here. When Thomas Boleyn died, Hever went to the crown because there was no male heir, and because the king took what he wanted. And Henry VIII gave it away. He gave it to Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife, as part of the settlement that persuaded her to agree quietly that she had never really been married to him at all. So the place where Anne Boleyn grew up was handed to the woman who came after the woman who came after her, as a consolation prize for being sent away undamaged. She lived there, on and off, for years, a German princess pottering about in the rooms of a family that the same man had destroyed, and she outlived every one of them, and every other wife, and died in her bed in the next reign but one. History does not arrange these things for our benefit, but occasionally it arranges them anyway, because he had made her, sent her away as a little girl to the finest court in Europe, so that she could be exactly the kind of woman who would own books like that, and been proud of her, and got that letter from Margaret of Austria saying how quick and bright his daughter was, and carried that around inside him for 25 years, and when she was dead and disgraced and her name struck out and her marriage annulled and her daughter bastardized, her father sat in the house where he had raised her and kept her books on his shelves. That is not a man who feels nothing. That is a man who has done something unforgivable and cannot undo it, and is left holding the objects. On the 3rd day of April in 1538, Elizabeth Howard died. She died at Howard House in Lambeth, which was her own family's place, the Norfolk seat across the river from Westminster, and not at Hever, and I do not know what to make of that, and neither does anybody else. Perhaps she was there for her health, or to be near the physicians of London, or because a dying woman wanted her own people about her at the end. Perhaps she had simply gone home. We know she had been ill. There is a report from a little earlier that she was sick, lying at a lodging near the river, and that she had a cough or something worse. And then, in the spring, she was gone. She was about 58. She had been married to Thomas Boleyn for something close to 40 years. She had borne 5 children and buried 4 of them, 2 as babies and 2 on the scaffold, and the 5th she had been made to disown. And she died 2 years, near enough, after the worst spring in English history took her son and her daughter in the same week. And I have never been able to read the sequence of those dates without thinking that the second thing caused the first. People do die of that. Not quickly, and not in a way any physician of that age could have named, but they do. Something goes out of them and does not come back, and then a fever that they would have shaken off a decade earlier carries them away. They buried her at Lambeth, in the church beside the Howard House, among her own family rather than beside her husband's people at Hever, and her tomb slab is still there, broken, rediscovered in our own time. And Thomas Boleyn paid for a fine funeral, and the heralds came, and it was done properly, as such things were done for the daughter of a duke. And that was the end of the last thing he had. I want to stay with him here for a moment, in that house at Hever in the spring that followed her death, because I think this is the loneliest place any person in this whole story ever stood. He is 61. His 2 sons died as children, so long ago now that hardly anybody living remembers them. His son George is under the floor of a chapel in the tower. His daughter Anne is beside him, in an arrow chest, in a grave that has no marker, because traitors do not get markers. His daughter Mary is alive somewhere, but she will not write to him, and he has not spoken to her in 4 years, because he cut her off, because she married a soldier she loved. His granddaughter Elizabeth is a bastard in a house in the country, being brought up by servants who have had to write anxious letters about the fact that she had outgrown all her clothes and nobody would authorize new ones. And now his wife of 4 decades is dead. That letter is real, by the way. and it is one of the small heartbreaks of the period. It was written in the months straight after the executions, when the child was 3 years old, and her mother a few weeks in the ground. The woman in charge of the little girl's household wrote to Cromwell to say that she had neither gown nor kirtle nor petticoat, no manner of linen, nothing at all, and begged him to see to it. A king's daughter, and her governess is reduced to writing to the Chief Minister of England to point out that the child has nothing to wear. Nobody knew what she was any more, you see. She had been a princess and heir to the throne, and then in a single summer she was a bastard, and her mother's name was Mud, and the clerks who authorised expenditure did not know what to write in the ledger, and so nothing was authorised, and a small girl in a house in Hertfordshire outgrew her clothes. Her grandfather was alive, an earl at Hever, 40 miles away. There is no record that he sent anything, everything, in 2 years, and he is still alive, and the mornings keep coming. There was one more thing too, and it is a small cruelty but a real one. In that same season, the earldom of Ormond, the great inheritance that had come to him through his mother, that he had fought Piers Butler for across 3 decades, was finally settled the other way. The Butler claim was recognised. The title he had been given as a reward for his daughter was taken back once his daughter was dead and could no longer be a reason for anything. He kept a version of it, a shadow of it, for the last months of his life, and there were technically 2 Earls of Ormond in the world at the same time, which is the sort of absurdity that only Tudor politics could produce. But the thing itself, the great prize, the inheritance that his mother had carried into the Boleyn family, and that he had spent his whole life chasing, was gone. He had traded a daughter for it, in effect, and now he had neither. And here is what he did. This is the part that people cite when they want to prove he was a monster. And I want to look at it properly. He went back to court. That same 12-month, the one in which his wife died, the Earl of Wiltshire reappeared. He came back. He attended. He was at Greenwich. He was about the king's business. He was seen. 2 years after his children were killed on trumped-up charges by that king, and months after his wife was buried, there he is again, in the presence chamber bowing. And there was even a rumour that autumn that he might marry again, and that the bride might be Margaret Douglas, the king's own niece, a young woman of about 22. He was 61. Naught came of it, and it may have been nothing but talk, the sort of speculative gossip that ran round that court like water. But somebody thought it plausible enough to write down, "Now, you can take that as grotesque." An old man whose family has been destroyed, crawling back to the destroyer, angling for a royal bride before his wife is cold. That reading is available, and I will not pretend otherwise. But here is the other reading, and I think it is the truer one, and it is much sadder. What else was he going to do? He was a courtier. He had been a courtier since he was a boy. It was the only life he had ever known, the only place he had ever been anybody, the only room in the world where he understood the rules. His house was full of ghosts. His wife was dead. His children were dead or estranged. He had no heir, no future, no line, no one to build for, and no reason to build. And he was 61, and there was nothing left except the thing he had done for 50 years, which was to go to court and be useful and be seen. So he went back. Not, I suspect, out of ambition. There was nothing left to be ambitious for. He went back because it was the only thing he knew how to do with a morning, and because sitting alone at Hever with the falcon badges on the walls was intolerable, and because a man has to be somewhere. I find that unbearably sad. The courtier who had nothing left to gain, putting on his robes, and going back to stand in the room where the man who killed his children was laughing at somebody's joke because he could not think of anywhere else to go. He died on the 12th of March in 1539, at Hever, in the house where his children had been born. He was about 62. He had outlived his wife by 11 months. And here is the whole of what we have about the death of the Earl of Wiltshire, Knight of the Garter, Lord Privy Seal of England, ambassador to France and the Empire, father of a queen and grandfather of another. One sentence, in a letter, written by a servant. Man called Richard Cranwell, who was one of his people at Hever, wrote to Thomas Cromwell to report it, because that was the procedure, because when a great man died, the king's chief minister had to be told. And he wrote this: My good lord and master is dead. He made the end of a good Christian man. That is it. That is the entire obituary of Thomas Boleyn. Look at what is in that sentence, though, because there is more in it than you would think. The opening phrase is a servant's formula, and we should not lean on it too hard. But servants had ways of saying these things, and the ways were not all identical, and a man who was hated by his household could be reported dead in language a great deal flatter than that. Cranwell calls him Lord and Master twice over, and puts a warm word in front of it, and nobody made him do that. Somebody in that house was sorry, and then the second half of it. To make the end of a good Christian man meant that he died well, meant he was conscious, and had his priest, and made his confession, and received the sacrament, and went in peace with the church, in the old faith he had been born into, and whatever his daughter had believed, never left. In that world there was no higher thing to say about a death. Such an end was what everybody prayed for, the one thing you could still get right when everything else had gone wrong, and Thomas Boleyn got it. He died in his own bed, in his own house, shriven and quiet, at the end of a long life. It is more than his son got. It is more than his daughter got. And I do not know whether that thought was anywhere in his head at the end, but I would be astonished if it was not. They buried him across the field, in the parish church of St. Peter at Hever, in the chapel that his own grandfather Geoffrey had built with the money from the cloth trade 70 years before. The wheel came all the way round. The mercer built a chapel for his family in a Kentish village, and 4 generations later, after the earldoms and the garter and the crown and the sword and the ruin, his grandson was carried in and laid down in it. And they laid a brass over him, and it is still there, and you can go and see it tomorrow if you like. Let me describe it to you, because this is where the evening has been going all along. It is a slab of black marble on a chest tomb, to the left of the high altar, under the arch of the Bull and Chapel, and on it is one of the finest monumental brasses in England. The chapel it lies in is small and plain and oddly domestic, and it has a fireplace in it, which is one of the strangest details in any English church I know. Somebody, presumably Geoffrey the mercer who built it, decided that when his family came to Mass on a freezing Kentish winter morning, they should not have to sit in the cold like everybody else, and installed a hearth. There is the whole family in one object. New money, unembarrassed, perfectly willing to be laughed at by people whose ancestors had shivered in that church for 300 years, and warm. And it is in that room, under that arch, a few feet from that fireplace, that they laid him down at the end, and the chapel his grandfather had built to keep the family comfortable became the place where the family stopped. He is shown full length, life-size, in the robes of a Knight of the Garter, the mantle and the hood, with the badge of the order on his breast, and the garter itself buckled about his left knee. It is a magnificent thing, and its whole language is the language of arrival. Everything about it says, "Here lies a great man, a member of the highest order of chivalry in this kingdom, an earl, a servant of princes." It is the memorial he had spent his whole life earning. His grandfather would have wept to see it. And at his feet there is a griffin, and under his head there is a helm, and on the helm there is a crest, and the crest is a falcon. a falcon displayed with its wings open. Now, the Boleyn family crest, the one Thomas had used, the one on the family arms, was a bull's head. That was the old badge, the punning badge, Boleyn and Bull, the mark of a family that had come up from Norfolk and thought a joke on their own name was a fine thing to carry. The falcon was not the Boleyn badge. The falcon was Anne's. She had adopted it when she was made a marquess in her own right and kept it as queen, and hers was crowned and standing on a tree stump with roses about it, a piece of heraldry stuffed with claims about her own royal descent, and the whole court knew it, and it had been painted and carved and stitched onto everything she owned for the 4 years she was in the sun. And in the spring of the year 1536 that badge became poison. When a person was attainted for treason, their arms were defaced. Their badges were pulled down, their glass was smashed out of the windows, their initials were chipped off the stonework, and the whole apparatus of their identity was scrubbed away. There is a famous chapel ceiling at Cambridge where you can still see where the Boleyn falcon was hacked away, and the Seymour badge put in its place, and where one falcon in a dark corner survived because the workman missed it. I want you to picture that work being done, because it is one of the eeriest images this century has to offer. Up on the scaffolding, in the cold, under that enormous fan vault, a gang of ordinary workmen with chisels going along the stonework, and their instruction is to remove a woman, not to punish her, she is already dead, to unmake her, to go through the king's own chapel and take out every falcon, every entwined initial, every crowned A, and replace it with the badges of the next wife, and to do it fast, because the wedding is in days. And they did it thoroughly, all the way along, and then somewhere near the end of the building somebody's eye slipped, or the light was bad, or the man was tired and it was high up and nobody would ever look, and one falcon was left. It is still there. You can go and find it. Anne Boleyn was scrubbed out of England by professionals, and one bird got through. And that is very nearly the whole story of what happens when power tries to erase a person. And 3 years later, in a village church in Kent, a falcon was carved above the head of a dead earl, and it stayed. I have to be careful here, and I will be. I cannot prove who chose that crest. Thomas Boleyn may have specified it in his will, and the will does not survive in a form that tells us. It may have been the heralds. It may have been Mary, who inherited everything, arranging her father's funeral and putting her sister back on the tomb because there was no other stone in England where anyone could put her. It may be that the falcon had, by some technical heraldic route, become an allowable crest for the family, and it meant nothing at all. But somebody did it. In a country where that badge had been chiselled off the walls of the king's own chapels, where the woman it belonged to was a convicted traitor whose name was not to be spoken, and whose daughter was a bastard, and whose marriage had never legally existed. Somebody put her falcon over her father's head in his grandfather's chapel in the church where he was christened, and left it there, and nobody took it down. It is still there. It has been there for nearly 500 years. So what became of them all? Let us gather them up, one by one, before we let this evening go, because there are endings here that are worth having. Mary got everything. The disowned daughter, the one who married a soldier for love, and was cast out and told she was cruel to write to, was the only surviving child, and when her father died, the Boleyn lands came to her. She and William Stafford went to live at Rochford Hall in Essex, which had been her father's, and they lived there quietly, out of the eye of the court, out of the histories, in the obscurity she had chosen when she chose him. She died 4 years after her father, in the summer, at about 43, and nobody recorded where she was buried, and nobody knows to this day. The most famous woman's sister in English history lies in an unmarked grave somewhere in England, and we cannot find her. But she had 15 summers or so with the man she wanted, and she had told the world plainly in writing that she would rather beg her bread with him than be the greatest queen in Christendom, and then she went and did it, more or less, and by every sign she never regretted it for a day. Her children did rather well. Catherine and Henry Carey, the two children born while the king was sleeping with their mother, grew up, and when their cousin came to the throne, they were taken up at once. Elizabeth made her cousin Catherine the chief lady of her privy chamber, and kept her beside her for the whole of her reign, and loved her, genuinely and demonstrably. And when Catherine died, the Queen paid for a funeral in Westminster Abbey of a magnificence quite out of proportion to the rank of the deceased, and went into a grief that alarmed her council. Henry Carey was made a baron and a Knight of the Garter, and served his cousin for 4 decades. Whatever they were, whoever their father was, Elizabeth kept the Boleyns close, and she kept the Careys closest of all, and I do not think that is an accident. The Howards went on, because the Howards always go on. Elizabeth's brother, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, the man who had presided over the trial of his own niece and wept as he sentenced her, went on to preside over the ruin of another niece, Catherine Howard, 5 years later, and helped destroy her too, and was himself condemned to death in the last days of Henry VIII, and saved only because the king died first, in the night, hours before the execution was to happen. He came out of the Tower under the next reign but one, an old man, and died in his bed. The family survived everything, as they always did. And Elizabeth, the bastardized granddaughter, the child nobody would buy gowns for, became Queen of England and reigned for 44 years and gave her name to the age. Here is the thing about Elizabeth that bears on our man tonight. She almost never spoke of her mother. In the whole of that long reign, from a woman who talked constantly and brilliantly and left more words behind her than almost any monarch in our history, there is a near total silence about Anne Boleyn. She did not rehabilitate her. She did not order a monument or a reburial or a re-examination of the case. Her mother stayed under the floor of that chapel in the Tower without a stone, but she wore a ring. There is a ring, and it is one of the most famous objects in England, a mother-of-pearl and gold locket ring that she wore until she died, and it opens, and inside there are 2 tiny enamelled portraits. One is Elizabeth herself, and the other is a woman in a French hood who is almost certainly Anne Boleyn. She wore her mother, in secret, against her hand for years, and never said a word about her out loud. That is a Boleyn to the bone, and I think her grandfather would have recognized it exactly. Say nothing, show nothing, keep the thing you love hidden where nobody can use it against you, and go on functioning, and let the world believe you feel none of it. And that, I find, is where I have arrived with Thomas Boleyn, after all these hours. The case against him is that he was cold, that he loved his own advancement more than he loved his children, that he spent his daughters and stood by while they died and went back to court. And the evidence for that is real, and I have not hidden any of it from you. He sat on that bench. His surviving daughter was so frightened of him that she took her begging to a stranger rather than to her own father. He surrendered the seal and bowed to the man who had done it. Those are facts, and they do not go away. But I have come to think that we have mistaken the evidence. What looks like coldness in Thomas Boleyn was, I believe, something else. It was the only technique he had. He was a professional survivor in a court where feeling out loud got you killed, and he had spent 50 years training himself to show nothing, to calculate, to keep his face still and his options open, because that was the skill that had carried a mercer's grandson to an earldom. And then the one catastrophe came that could not be survived by technique, and he reached for the only tool in his hand, and it was the wrong tool, and it was hideous, and he used it anyway because he had no other. And underneath it, I think there was a man who felt a great deal and had no language for any of it. Look at what is actually left of him when you strip away the offices. A letter from a great princess of Europe, telling him his daughter was clever and quick, and a delight, which he kept and which somebody preserved. A library of a dead woman's books in a house full of ghosts. A marriage of 40 years that never broke, and a death 11 months after hers. A servant who wrote that his good lord and master had made the end of a good Christian man, and a falcon carved above his head in his grandfather's chapel, in the one place in England where nobody could take it down. And I want to be careful about this, because it would be easy and it would be false to turn him into a secret sentimentalist at the last moment. A warm man in a cold coat, and I do not believe that either. The truth is probably harder and greyer. I think he was a man who had made himself into an instrument, over 50 years, deliberately, because that was how a family like his rose, and by the end there was very little of him left that was not instrument. I think he loved his children in the way such men did, which was to want great things for them, and to arrange those things, and to be proud, and which had almost nothing to do with the kind that would make a man stand up in a courtroom and ruin himself for nothing. And I think that when the reckoning came, he discovered, far too late to be any use, that the difference between those two kinds of love is the whole of everything, and that he had spent his life on the wrong one. That is not a villain. That is a tragedy, and it is a very ordinary one, and it is still going on in families tonight. He never said he loved her, not once, anywhere, in any surviving word. Men of his kind and his century did not, and if he had said it that spring it would have killed him and everyone else left standing. So he said it in brass, after he was dead, where it was safe, and he has been saying it in that little church ever since. If the hours we have spent together in that far-off world have brought you some measure of peace, and carried you a little way out of your own day, then I am glad of it, and if you would like more of these quiet evenings to come and find you, you are always welcome to follow along. But that is a small thing, and it can wait for the morning. For now, wherever you are, and whatever the hour, let the old man rest, and let Hever and its moat and its quiet chapel fade gently into the dark, and let yourself grow still. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.